The Call of Duty Black Ops series is one of the most well-known and widely played series in gaming. It's also one of the most interesting, especially when it comes to the campaigns. The Black Ops campaigns aren't afraid to experiment, and by doing so, they've pushed the boundaries of the series. Black Ops hit the ground off running with its first entry. The first Black Ops tells one of the greatest stories in gaming. Black Ops 2 changed up the formula, introducing a branching narrative where your choices had real consequences, and the series continued to iterate and ideate from there. Unfortunately, there's a dark side to the Black Ops story. With so much innovation and change between game entries, Black Ops started to lose its sense of identity, at least when it came to the campaigns. It became hard to identify what the game shared in common. When Black Ops 4 came out, it didn't even have a campaign. The very future of the series, in terms of single player, was very uncertain. But with the release of Cold War, the series finally found its identity again. So join me on this journey as we analyze each of the mainline Black Ops campaigns. We'll see how each game tells their stories and supports them via gameplay. We'll ride through the game's ups and downs. We'll witness a series that started with a bold identity, then lost it, only to find it again. We'll discover what truly makes a Black Ops campaign a Black Ops campaign. One quick plug before I begin. I'm a science fiction writer, so I especially appreciate the hard work that goes into creating an interesting plot. My series, The Northfield Saga, is a post-apocalyptic series focused on a man, Mark Northfield, who is blackmailed into assassinating a target. Little does he know, his target holds the key to saving the world. It would mean a lot if you checked out my novels and supported my dream. The fourth and final book comes out this year, so I'm really making a push to get reads and reviews on the series to build some momentum. If you want to support me further, it would help in a big way. Links are in the video description. Okay, now let's start with Black Ops 1. Call of Duty Black Ops is the best story in the franchise, but it goes even further than that. I think Black Ops is one of the best stories in first-person shooter history. It's thrilling, engaging, and captivating from the opening up until the second the credits roll. But what makes this story so captivating? How does it hook so deeply into the player, making the journey inescapable until its conclusion? It's because Black Ops understands the importance of two things: questions and revelations. We're going to dive deep into the campaign and investigate what makes it so great. In particular, we're going to look at how Black Ops constantly instills new questions in the player, while also steadily giving them revelations. The storytelling of Black Ops begins before the opening cutscene. The main menu, in fact, is used as a vehicle for the story. The player sees themselves from Alex Mason's perspective, strapped to a chair in a dingy interrogation room. The interrogator barks questions at you about numbers and remembering things.
Focus, Mason. Try to remember.
This main menu segment is actually playable too. By rapidly hitting the triggers, Mason can break out of his chair and wander around the room. In fact, there's even a terminal that you can enter cheat codes into to unlock the Dead Ops arcade. But that's just an aside. What the menu really succeeds at is creating an immediate air of mystery, and it prompts you to ask questions. Who is Mason? Who's interrogating him, and why? I wish more games used their main menus as creatively as Black Ops. It's a great example of how Black Ops uses every tool at its disposal to build suspense. When the campaign begins officially, we stay with Mason in the interrogation room. As questions are drilled into him, we learn a few key things. Our first few revelations. Mason is a former CIA operative. More than an operative, he was in fact an assassin. There's also some broadcast station that the interrogator expects Mason to know of. Numbers also flash across the screen. The interrogator doesn't know what they mean, but he expects Mason to. There's also mention of men named Viktor Reznov and Dragovich. So we have a few details, but we don't really have any idea how they're related. It once more builds that curiosity, because the game is giving you all these questions that you want answers to. The story of Black Ops is an onion. With each level, we slowly peel back layer after layer until we get to the center. The constant infusion of new questions, paired with constant revelations, is what gives this story such a magnetic, almost addictive feel. You want to keep pushing on so you can get answers, but as you get more answers, you get more and more questions. Our interrogator asks about the Bay of Pigs. Mason and his team, composed of Frank Woods and Joseph Bowman, were sent in to kill Castro. Here is where our investigation begins. The mission starts with Mason and his guys in a Cuban bar, going over the plan. Woods and Bowman are the types of guys you'd expect from the CIA. Cool, cold-blooded killers. We see their level composure when they're compromised by Castro's men. They don't freak out, but instead get right down to business. They fight through opposition and escape the bar. There's an interruption. The interrogators are losing Mason, so they shock him. While Mason is seized by pain, numbers scroll across the screen. Here's another detail revealed. The numbers aren't just purely intel that Mason knows about. There seems to be some connection between them and his psyche. We return to the mission. Mason's team infiltrates Castro's compound while their allies provide a distraction at the airfield. They manage to accomplish their mission and take out Castro. All that's left is to escape. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a hitch on their way out. The runway needs to be cleared, otherwise the plane can't take off. Mason jumps off and mans a turret. He shoots away the debris, allowing his guys to escape. There's a cost to his heroism though. Mason is captured by the enemy. When he comes to, he finds himself at the feet of a few men. First is unbelievably Castro himself. But we just killed him, right?
You're dead. We killed you. No. You killed a double. You think we didn't know of your plan?
We always know.
Here's our first twist in the game. It establishes a few things. First, our enemies are crafty and intelligent, and their planning goes beyond what we expected. Second, and most importantly, it establishes that things in this story are not always as they appear. People are not always who they claim to be. Dragovich is also here. We recognize the name from the interrogation room earlier. This is a perfect example of Black Ops' engaging form of storytelling. The story implicitly sets up questions by name-dropping him in the interrogation room. Who is Dragovich, and what's his connection to Mason? Well, here we get some answers. Dragovich is a communist, allied with the likes of Castro, and he and Mason's connection is first established by Mason's capture in Cuba. But even though we have answers to our initial questions, we're then given a fresh new set of questions. What is Dragovich's plan? To what ends are he and Castro allied? What does he plan on doing with Mason? Why is Mason kept alive? It goes back to what I was saying, where it's this stream of revelations paired with constant questions which makes the narrative so exhilarating. You get this satisfaction of having your curiosity sated right as you're being pulled by the hooks of new questions. We find out where Mason was taken. Vorkuta, a harsh labor camp. Dragovich did things to him, but the details are still vague. In the prison, we get another revelation. We learn of the other man we heard about during interrogation, Viktor Reznov. He's Mason's friend, but he's also punching Mason in the face. Once more, the expectation is being set that people are not always as they first appear in the story. Seeds are being planted. Reznov and Mason are putting on an act to lure a guard in. They take out the guard and grab his keys. Here, their grand plan is set into motion.
Now! We take Vorkuta! What is step 2?
Ascend from darkness!
3!
Rain fire!
4!
Unleash the horde!
5!
Skewer the wicked beast!
I played a large portion of this clip because frankly, I just love it. It does such a great job of amping you up for this prison break. You're some grubby guy with a prison shank, but you're joined by your brothers in darkness, rising out of this hellish place for freedom. I mean, especially when we're joined by the likes of our boy Sergey, how can you not get hyped? This is a good time to mention too that this isn't actually Reznov's first appearance in the series. He was a major player in Treyarch's prior game, World at War. The player fought with him against the Nazis in Russia, and he was a well-liked character. This isn't necessary information in Black Ops. If you didn't play World at War, you don't feel like you're missing out. However, for those that did play World at War, Reznov is a character you're already familiar with. He's a character that you like and that you trust. You don't have your guard up, which makes the revelations later in the game more effective. Mason and Reznov fight their way through the prison. In another brilliant stroke, there is a power progression to the gameplay that perfectly matches the narrative. You start off with nothing more than a prison shank, weak, vulnerable, and ineffective. You work your way up to a pistol, which is better, but you're still very much outgunned. Then, as the prison break continues, you get your hands on shotguns and assault rifles. Finally, you end the mission with a minigun, tearing apart your opponents. This progression enhances the narrative feeling of triumph and success, as the plan continues to succeed step by step. Mason and Reznov make it out, but at the very end there's a complication. Only Mason escapes from the prison. Reznov is left behind.
Your turn! Come on! Step 8, Reznov! Freedom!
For you, Mason! Not for me!
Reznov!
But this is not the last we'll see of our Russian friend. Answers followed by more questions. We know how Mason got out now, but now we're left wondering how Reznov eventually escapes. Mason links back up with the CIA, and he's assigned to Jason Hudson. The government wants Mason to kill Dragovich, but that isn't all.
The government wanted Dragovich. They wanted you to kill him.
Yeah. There were others. Others I was supposed to kill.
Who? Who, Mason?
This line is planting another seed. Mason heads to the Pentagon with Hudson, and here he's given his assignment. When he reaches the Pentagon, he's paranoid. He feels like he's being watched. It's clear that there isn't something quite right about Mason. Something's gnawing at him, and the numbers are in his head bothering him. The interrogator asks if Mason neared his objective. It's clear that he isn't talking about Dragovich. When they reach the nerve center, Reznov's prison plan comes to Mason's mind.
I don't know. It felt like I was in a dream. Step 2, ascend from darkness. Step 3, rain fire.
You were getting close to your objective. It was working.
This doesn't really make sense at the moment, but it becomes relevant later. Mason finally meets the president himself, JFK. But his headaches seem to grow even worse. He even seems to hallucinate holding a gun to the president. Or is it a hallucination? Is he the objective that the interrogator is referring to? This Pentagon scene is brilliant. A lot of the elements here don't make sense at the moment, but when looking back at the scene, it's layers upon layers of foreshadowing. I'll go into more detail once those revelations come. JFK goes into the current plan. Mason is tasked with taking out the Russian space program, particularly their long-range missile project. He deploys on the mission with Woods. Unfortunately, there's a complication right away. One of their agents, Weaver, is burned. He is in the hands of Dragovich's second-in-command, Kravchenko. He's immediately established as a cruel, sadistic man as he stabs out Weaver's eye. Woods and Mason disguise themselves and infiltrate the facility. They save Weaver and make their way to the auxiliary control bunker to abort the launch and kill the scientists. Mason, when asked, denies this.
You saved his life. Now you had to locate the Ascension group and kill the scientists.
No. I had to kill Dragovich.
Instead, he insists that his goal is to kill Dragovich, which is not the primary objective he was tasked with. This is another seed being planted. We are starting to see Mason's fixation with killing Dragovich, even at the expense of other objectives. This will continue to intensify throughout the story. They manage to take out the Ascension group, and they find Dragovich's limo. They take the vehicle out, but they don't confirm the kill. This eats at Mason, and he grows obsessed. We see that Mason's motivation isn't merely revenge or anger over what happened to him. Something is in his head compelling him to find Dragovich. Mason is then deployed to Vietnam, once again working under Frank Woods, this time in an SOG group tasked with reconning covert Russian activity. Then the war turns south, and the NVA surrounds Hue City. There's a Russian defector in the MACV compound who has information on Dragovich. The interrogator says that recovering the defector is a lost cause. The NVA burned the compound to the ground, and he is surely dead.
It was a lost cause, and you still went in. Why?
His protection team had gone dark. I couldn't accept that he was dead.
Mason cries out in desperation. He just can't accept that the defector is dead. He needs information on Dragovich, and based on his tone, it feels like his very life depends on it. It's that compulsion rearing its head again. He goes in any way to recover him. The atmosphere of the level goes even further than being war-torn. The Reds, fire, and rubble create a truly apocalyptic sight. This reinforces the interrogator's words and makes you think that nobody could have survived this, including the defector. Despite the ruins and the wreckage, Mason finds the defector alive and well. It's none other than Viktor Reznov. It's a miracle that seems too good to be true. And well, you know what they say about things that are a little too good to be true. Reznov picks up the dossier from a desk. Aside it, there's a body of a man who looks like he could be Russian. I mean, hypothetically, if Reznov wasn't here, then maybe this could be the body of the true defector, who the interrogator said is certainly dead. Hypothetically, of course. Reznov too seems to share the same fixation of killing Dragovich that Mason does.
Dragovich, Kravchenko, Steiner, all must die.
They run into Woods and Bowman outside. If you notice, neither Woods or Bowman actually acknowledges Reznov. However, the dialogue is written in an ambiguous enough way where this may pass by you. Black Ops is brilliant because it lays out all the groundwork for the true explanation for things right in front of your eyes. The true defector, Reznov's fixations being shared by Mason, and Reznov not being acknowledged by anyone else. But the story is still discreet enough where you probably won't notice any of these until you play through the game again. Mason and his allies manage to escape Hughes City with dossier in hand. The dossier provides IDs for all of Kravchenko's men. They're masterminds of something called Project Nova, or Nova 6. Mason's handler Hudson is sent to capture and interrogate Dr. Clark, the chemical engineer behind Nova 6. He and Weaver nab the scientist, and they get creative with their questioning. Clark is tough-lipped because he thinks he's better off dead anyway. He predicts that Dragovich is on his way too. The engineer is right. Dragovich's thugs arrive at the scene. Gunfire ruptures Nova 6 canisters, buying Hudson and the others an opportunity to escape. The level is a frenetic chase, as the operatives escape Dragovich's men by bounding across rooftops and weaving through buildings. It's one of my favorite levels in the game, as the rainy setting feels straight out of an action movie. The prevalence of dual-wield weapons makes you feel even more like a movie star. We play as Hudson in this mission, and it feels very fitting. He's a cold, calculating man with nerves of pure steel. Above all, he's ruthlessly effective. As their enemies close in, they make a big leap onto an angled roof. Clark loses his grip and Hudson catches him. However, things go south. This is an important discovery for Hudson. The numbers are important. Although Clark died before you could explain further, Hudson knows they are critical to stopping Dragovich. He escapes. There's one other piece of information Clark told Hudson during interrogation. He ID'd a Nazi scientist named Steiner. They are headed to Mount Yamantau. During Mason's interrogation, Mason reflects on when he first heard about Nova 6. His friend Reznov told him during captivity.
Vorkuta. Reznov told me at Vorkuta.
What did he tell you?
Mason, listen to me.
It was a long time ago. Far away.
Dragovich, Steiner, Kravchenko, all must die.
This phrase has been drilled into us over and over by Reznov. It's sounding less and less like purely a statement of Reznov's own conviction. It sounds like indoctrination. Reznov was deployed to the Arctic Circle to hunt down the last of the Reich. At least that's what he believed. We deploy on the mission in his shoes. Kravchenko and Dragovich are in command, and that doesn't bode well. They instill the need to keep Steiner alive. This is the same scientist as earlier. This creates a lot of tension. Reznov doesn't trust them, not an inch.
What happened in Stalingrad between you and Dragovich?
When the German occupation began, he and his lapdog, Kravchenko, left my men and I hopelessly outnumbered. Promises of reinforcements were made, but not kept. Dragovich and Kravchenko are opportunists, manipulators. They are not to be trusted, Dmitri.
Dmitri Pevtrenko, Reznov's friend, is actually the playable character from the Russian sections of World at War. So there is a connection here for returning players. We know Reznov was eventually imprisoned for some reason, so a crash course between him and Dragovich seems imminent. They fight through the enemy base, with Dragovich reiterating Steiner's importance. Along the way, Reznov has the opportunity to spare the lives of surrendering enemies, but he offers them no mercy. This feels very in character for Reznov following World at War. He's not the type of man to take his enemies prisoners, not after the hell they wrought in his homeland. They connect with Steiner. Reznov and his friend Petrenko do not trust how buddy-buddy Dragovich is with the German.
Dragovich and Steiner are talking like old friends. I do not like this, Reznov.
No, Dmitri. Be on your guard.
Their mission isn't done yet. There is something else Dragovich is after. Nova 6. The tension increases, and the game almost verges on horror as Reznov creeps through dark claustrophobic corridors with his pistol. They find Nova 6, and the imminent betrayal follows. In a twist of sadistic curiosity, Dragovich tests the weapons on his opponents. Among them is Petrenko. Reznov watches his friend die. We as the audience get to witness the dire effects of Nova 6 on its victims. It gives us a grim look into the future if we don't stop Dragovich. This moment has special impact on returning World at War players. Our player character, the person we played as alongside Reznov and bared trial after trial with, dies with the dignity of a 2-cent lab rat. But regardless of the player's familiarity with the past game, the injustice to a loyal soldier here is plain for all to see. We understand why Reznov hates Dragovich and his ilk so much. With Mason's mistreatment in mind too, we're beginning to make quite a list of reasons why the player wants to take Dragovich out. British commandos arrive, who are also after Nova 6. Although they present a threat to Reznov and those loyal to him, they also provide a distraction. Reznov weaves his way through the opposing forces, determined to sink the ship so no side possesses this horrible weapon. Reznov succeeds, at least for now. Despite Reznov's heroism during the war and during this mission, he's still sent to Vorkuta for his transgressions against Dragovich. The interrogator wants to know more about Mason's reunion with Reznov, so they return to Vietnam.
North. We went north. Viet Cong. We were shut down, and Reznov even survived that.
It's funny how Reznov has such a knack for survival. They fight their way out of the crash helicopter, and Reznov splits with them to scout out ahead. Once again, if you're paying close attention, you'll notice that Woods still never acknowledges Reznov's presence. The mission is a fun change of pace. The predators turn prey as Woods and Mason skulk through the river, taking out hostiles quietly. Eventually, Mason and Woods relink with Whiskey, which includes Bowman. Kravchenko has a military compound near the village, and they're going to try and take it. After clearing the village, they uncover a rat tunnel. It needs to be cleared, and Mason volunteers, along with a soldier named Swift. Mason creeps through the tunnels, armed with a flashlight and pistol. It's reminiscent of Reznov's section in the wrecked ship, and it evokes the same horror vibes. You aren't the king of these tunnels. This is the Viet Cong's domain, and you're reminded of that. A familiar face appears, almost taking a bullet. It's Reznov. He's here to help Mason. Reznov's always here to help Mason. He decides to split up and work his way through the tunnels. Abruptly, Swift calls out Mason.
What the fuck's wrong with you?
For a new player, this comment strikes you as strange. What on earth is Swift talking about? Mason didn't do anything wrong. Swift's reaction makes perfect sense in retrospect. It's the story planting another seed, so when the big revelation comes, it's surprising, but it also feels earned. The best twists come when things never quite feel right, and the pieces don't fit together, but the newest revelation makes all the pieces come together. And that's exactly what Black Ops delivers, built upon moments like these. The game pulls another clever little trick here. Immediately after Swift's reaction, he's killed, and the action ramps up. It's highly tense, as Mason is only equipped with his revolver, and he has to contend with the dark tunnels. The player shifts their attention to the burst of action, and because of that, they don't get the opportunity to dwell on Swift's reaction too much. They notice it as an oddity, but they don't get to think about it. Reznov rejoins Mason, and they find out Kravchenko has been performing Nova 6 tests on the local population. As if we needed another reason to find these guys despicable. Kravchenko rigged the tunnels to blow, so Mason makes a desperate escape from the tunnels. This section is claustrophobia inducing to say the least. They make it out though and are picked up by Woods. The interrogator confirms what Mason learned from the mission, that Kravchenko was operating in Laos and killing people with his experiments. He then warns Mason that Reznov is not to be trusted.
Listen to me carefully, Mason. Reznov cannot be trusted. No matter what he tells you, no matter what he says.
But he gave us the dossier on Clark. He led us to Nova 6.
Reznov's not who you think he is.
No, he's my friend. He helped me escape.
This plants more seeds. It also prompts more questions. Reznov so far has been one of the most trustworthy guys we know. He's helped us more times than we can count, and he hates our enemies even more than we do. Why can't we trust him? What I also love about this section is the preciseness and subtlety of the dialogue. The interrogator speaks about Reznov in the active present voice. This plus the urgency in the interrogator's voice is a bit odd considering Mason's predicament. He's strapped into the chair of some holding cell at the interrogator's mercy. Presumably, the interrogator could make sure that Mason never speaks to Reznov, or anybody else for that matter, ever again. Yet, the interrogator is speaking like Reznov right now may say something to Mason, even though he's alone. It's another oddity, another subtle seed being planted. The interrogator continues Mason's story.
I had to kill him. You understand? I have to kill them all.
Once more, Mason's desire seems more like compulsion at this point than conviction. Mason complains about the numbers. Here we get another big revelation that leads to more questions.
It's a broadcast, Mason. The numbers are a broadcast. You've been brainwashed.
Mason has been brainwashed. The numbers are a broadcast. This naturally leads us to wonder, a broadcast from who? What is it broadcasting? Perhaps above all, to what end was Mason brainwashed? Before Kravchenko can be handled, another mission awaits. A Soviet plane went down with Nova 6, and Mason's SOG team is sent in to recover it. They reach the plane, but the Nova 6 is nowhere to be found. They get the location of Kravchenko's compound at least. Mason seems singularly focused.
Kravchenko, he must die.
Okay, Mason. Let's go.
With the interrogator's revelation in mind, the deadness in which Mason speaks is concerning. He seems compelled to kill Kravchenko. His compulsion we witnessed before wasn't illusory. Mason seems like he has commands that he must follow. Things turn south before Mason's SOG unit can act on that intel. Kravchenko and Dragovich capture them. Mason's unit is presumed KIA, so Hudson continues the search for Nova 6 without them. He heads to the complex in Mount Yamantau. This is where Hudson learns about the numbers. This mission is another interesting change of pace, as you initially take control of a pilot named Mosley. He's in a recon aircraft, and he guides the squad on the ground via commands. It plays somewhat like a very simple strategy game. Perspective periodically switches to the soldiers on the ground as they clear out buildings. It's a unique segment that also doesn't overstay its welcome. Hudson and his guys accomplish their objective of cutting out the complex's comms. Now they can move on to the base itself. I love this mission. The setting and atmosphere are great. As you rappel down the side of the mountain, it feels like something straight out of a James Bond movie. They take down the Comstat and make their way down with an avalanche close behind. They breach the Nova 6 facility. However, they soon discover that Steiner was expecting them.
Targets marked across the states.
All across America, there already has sleeper cells waiting for the signal to release the Nova 6.
Weaponized Nova 6.
The numbers broadcast. What do they
In
mean?
36 hours, the sleeper agents will receive their final orders. Only I can tell you how to stop the broadcast.
Here, at last, Dragovich's grand plan is revealed. We finally understand what the broadcasts are for. They're to awake the sleeper agents and give them their final orders. Hudson and his men fight their way out of the facility with a new objective in mind. They need to reach Steiner. The interrogator reiterates this intel to Mason before we get another piece of intel.
Why the hell do you think that I know where it is?
You're in Vorkuta, Mason. We know what happens in Vorkuta. They programmed you. You can translate the codes.
Now we understand the interrogator's desperation, why he's wasting so much time interrogating Mason and sifting through his memories with a fine-tuned comb. We've learned a lot from this level, but it produces another big question. Hudson and his guys went after Steiner. He seems to know something about the broadcasts. Presumably, the scientists would have all the intel they need. Why do they need Mason so badly? Why does it seem like everything hinges on him? It doesn't quite add up. Not yet. Mason recalls the second time imprisoned by Dragovich. The sadism and brutality of Kravchenko is demonstrated once more, as a Soviet interrogator and the Viet Cong force the Americans to play Russian roulette. Bowman refuses to play, and he's killed for his disobedience. Woods is next. He and Mason are to play until one of them pulls an unlucky trigger. But Mason and Woods aren't willing to die without fighting. Woods alerts Mason when the bullet is in the chamber, and they go on the offensive. A quick, brutal attack which buys them weapons and a chance. They chase and take down the Russian that killed Bowman. Instead of escaping, they go on the offensive. They head to Kravchenko's compound. Inside, they find American POWs. Reznov is among them. Woods wants to get the POWs out, but Mason, like Reznov, is laser focused on killing Kravchenko. The two are always in alignment, it seems, and Mason is willing to prioritize killing Kravchenko above everything else. He reaches Kravchenko's office, and he gets his wish. Kravchenko is killed, but it comes at a cost. Woods is killed, or at least apparently. Mason is all alone. Well, no, not quite. He has Reznov. He always has Reznov.
Dragovich, Kravchenko, Stein. all must die.
Mason goes rogue. He heads to Rebirth Island to mark another name off his list, Steiner. From Mason's perspective, he was just continuing the mission, but clearly this was the exact opposite of what the CIA wanted.
Dragovich, Kravchenko, Steiner, they all had to die.
We wanted Steiner alive! Why did you have to kill him?
Because the numbers were telling me to!
Another piece falls into place. Another question is answered. The interrogator is so reliant on Mason because Mason killed Steiner, the scientist who had all the answers they needed. Mason fades, and he returns to Rebirth Island. This mission is brilliant. It's rife with tension, and this is due to dramatic irony. We as the audience know that Mason and Reznov are about to do something very bad. Meanwhile, Mason thinks he's doing the right thing, or at the very least, accomplishing his mission. When they break into the laboratory, Hudson overtakes the comms. He's on Rebirth Island too. Despite Hudson's pleas, Mason continues on. Nothing will stop him from accomplishing his mission. Like we saw in Vietnam, when it comes to killing Kravchenko, Dragovich, and Steiner, everything else is forfeit to Mason. He reaches Steiner. The scientist recognizes him. He says that Mason doesn't know what they did to him. Here, the story is prompting more questions. It feels like we have most of this plot figured out, but Steiner is telling us that we still don't understand what's truly going on. The intrigue deepens. Mason lets Reznov take the reins. He deals his punishment to Steiner. Men in hazmat suits arrive. They try to break in through the window as Reznov pulls the trigger. The interrogator doubts Mason's story. It was Mason who killed Steiner, not Reznov. Hudson saw it himself. The story goes back in time. We're in Hudson's shoes. He and Weaver arrived on the opposite end of the island. Once again, there's a ton of tension here because we know how this section is going to end, with a confrontation in Steiner's dead body. Dragovich's thugs deploy Nova 6. Fortunately, Hudson has a hazmat suit, but some of his soldiers aren't so lucky. The gameplay segment here is great. We fight through the hazy toxic gas, and there's a claustrophobic feeling induced by the hazmat suit. Past that, the suit has an effect on gameplay. Instead of a regenerating health system, your mask progressively cracks as you take damage. If you take too much, well, you can say goodbye to breathing. It's really creative, and it makes this combat segment feel fresh. It makes me wish the series played more around with base mechanics like health, while still keeping you in the boots of a soldier on the ground. I feel like most of the gameplay variation in the series is provided by vehicle segments. Eventually, Hudson and Weaver reach the lab. Now we are those guys in hazmat suits, trying to break in while Steiner dies. This time, however, we see a very different sight. There is no Reznov. It's Mason alone confronting Steiner.
It's Victor! Reznov! And I will have my
Revenge! Mason, no!
Mason calls himself Victor Reznov and pulls the trigger. Hudson breaks through, but it's too late. Steiner, their best lead, is dead. Reznov was never there. It's the biggest twist in the game and the biggest revelation. We return to the interrogation room. Before we have much of a chance to breathe, another revelation follows. Our interrogator reveals his identity, but you likely pieced it together yourself by now. It's none other than Hudson, accompanied by Weaver. Hudson drills the revelation into Mason's head.
Reznov's dead, Mason. Did you hear me? He's dead! Weaver's right. We're out of time.
He lets Mason out to establish trust, but Mason isn't willing to accept what Hudson tells him. He strikes his handler and wanders off. In a rush, memories return to Mason.
His responses to our orders have been sporadic, unpredictable. He shows a remarkable resilience.
If he will not follow the orders embedded in the numbers, then he is of no use to me. He can rot. Take him back to his cell.
Dragovich and his goons brainwashed Mason, but he showed remarkable resilience to their orders. Dragovich deemed him unuseful and cast him back into his cell in Vorkuta to rot. But where Dragovich saw failure, Reznov saw opportunity. Reznov counter-programmed Mason, retrofitting him for his revenge quest. Reznov died at Vorkuta, but Mason is his revenge from beyond the grave. This twist is just brilliant. It serves as a genuine eureka moment, as all the oddities throughout the game, all the things that weren't quite explainable, now make perfect sense, both the big things and the little. For instance, this explains why Reznov wanted Mason to escape so badly, prioritizing Mason over his own life. Reznov wants his revenge, but he has no resources left. His government betrayed him, and the Americans certainly won't help him. Mason, on the other hand, is still a US operative, with all the contacts that the job entails. Out of the two men, Mason stands a much better chance of killing his targets. So, Reznov lets himself be taken and killed during the escape to let Mason go. The game doesn't need to explain this motivation to us. Reznov's brainwashing of Mason implicitly does that. Likewise, everything that happened during the Pentagon scene comes into clarity. When Hudson said that Mason was nearing his objective, he's referring to Dragovich's attempt to brainwash Mason into killing Kennedy. We see the brainwashing attempt to take root as Mason has images flash through his head of killing Kennedy. But he doesn't do it. Dragovich's programming was unreliable, and Reznov overrode it for his own mission, which is far more effective on Mason. We see Reznov's programming in the same scene, as Mason recalls his command.
It felt like I was in a dream. Step 2, ascend from darkness. Step 3, rain fire.
Why is Reznov's programming more effective? Well, it goes back to what Dr. Steiner said. Mason has a strong will. Obviously, he's going to be very resistant to the idea of killing his president. But Reznov's goals aren't that far off from Mason's. Mason does want to kill those 3 men too. So, Reznov's programming is able to take root better. Then there's the moment in the tunnels when Swift calls Mason out. We see now why he had this reaction. Mason was talking to himself like a crazy person. I could go on, but I think I've made my point. The best twists in stories make everything that came before snap together, like the last piece of a puzzle being slotted into place. Black Ops is the very best video game example I can think of doing this. With Steiner gone, Mason is their only shot of locating the broadcast station. With his mind cleared, Mason thinks deeply. The numbers finally start to make sense. He hears Dragovich's voice. At last he locates the broadcast.
Where?
Cuba.
One last mission. Mason joins Hudson's unit to strike the ship where Dragovich is broadcasting from. They soften the target via choppers, then drop onto the ship to close in on their quarry. At first it did strike me as a bit strange that Hudson brought Mason along for this op, given his unstable mental state. Who can say if Mason is going to be overcome by brainwashing and do something horrible? But Mason hones in on a secret underground base located below the ship. It validates Hudson's decision for me. Mason's their only link to the broadcasts, so he's a useful asset in the field. The juice is worth the squeeze here, I guess. They raid the underground base, taking out Dragovich's goons before closing in on the man himself. Mason throttles him, but this moment of success is undercut by one unsettling word from Dragovich.
It's like you turned me against my own. It's like I'm making kill my own president.
Right?
One word, one sardonic grin, is enough to put a pit of dread in the player's stomach. Mason finishes the job. His programming by Reznov is complete as well. Kravchenko, Dragovich, Steiner, now they're all dead. He returns to the surface with Hudson. The US military awaits, American flags waving. The music crescendos, and it feels like a very patriotic, upbeat ending. Or it would be, except for Dragovich's words. Even in death, he doesn't seem like a man who lost. He seems like a man who won. A woman sits at a broadcast station. She lists numbers. Numbers we now know correspond to programming, to orders given to sleeper agents. Reznov could strike from the grave via brainwashing. Dragovich can too. November 2nd, 1963. Texas. Mason starts translating the numbers into commands.
10, 2, 1.
Texas.
Kennedy's fateful motorcade. In the game's last photo, we see Mason in the crowd, staring intently at the president. Did Mason do it? Was he Kennedy's assassin? Well, the game leaves it up to you to decide. Black Ops is a game that has constantly given us new questions. Here at its very end, it leaves us one final question, and I think it's the perfect way to conclude the game. Call of Duty Black Ops is a masterpiece. It uses the video game medium to its fullest to spin an intriguing tale that leaves you on the edge of your seat. The constant stream of revelations, plus more questions, creates a hook of satisfaction and newfound curiosity that's irresistible. Black Ops is one of the best stories in any first-person shooter, and I think it's the peak of Call of Duty stories. So after such a masterful entry, where can Black Ops successors go? How can they top what Black Ops did? Well, that's where things get interesting. They don't really try to top Black Ops 1. Each subsequent game takes a step in a different direction. The Black Ops series constantly reinvents itself, experimenting in storytelling with each entry. Black Ops 2 ventures into entirely new territory. Black Ops 2 is the most ambitious Call of Duty campaign of all time. While most campaigns focus on one era of time, be it past, present, or future, the story of Black Ops 2 spans multiple time periods. It stretches from the 1980s all the way into the 2020s. 40 years, 2 generations, a grand scope, all in the span of a single game. But Black Ops 2 isn't content with stopping there. The game introduces branching narrative paths. Your actions throughout the game influence the story's outcome, from small details all the way up to the main conflict's resolution. This grand narrative ambition is also paired with a host of new gameplay innovations. There are customizable weapon loadouts and perk systems, and there are even side missions that transform gameplay into an almost real-time strategy game. Without a doubt, Black Ops 2 shakes up the traditional campaign model that, by the game's release in 2012, had become a familiar and comfortable format, but it had also started to become stale by the time Black Ops 2 arrived. We all know the story of Icarus, the Greek legend whose ambition grew too great and he flew too close to the sun. He came crashing down. Black Ops 2 has no shortage of ambition, but the question is, are these innovations beneficial to the storytelling of the game? Do they result in a full, rich story and immerse the player? Well, that's what we're here to investigate. We're going to dive into Black Ops 2's campaign, and we're going to analyze its story and how its gameplay and mechanics feed into enhancing the narrative experience. We're going to focus on the new innovations Black Ops 2 introduces, especially the branching narratives. The way that Black Ops 2 incorporates its branching narratives is very unique, and I find it fascinating. Black Ops 2 has a killer opening. It's maybe the best opening in the entire series, with stiff competition from its predecessor. Black Ops 1's opening was so brilliant because it introduced a litany of questions which piqued the player's curiosity. Black Ops 2 uses the same technique. A bunch of vehicles storm a compound. Soldiers pour out, ready for action, only for the player to find out that they're raiding a retirement home. Inside resides Frank Woods, one of the supporting characters from Black Ops 1. We thought he had died in that game, but clearly he's still alive, and with his trademark wit intact.
Safety's on, dipshit.
Hey, old man.
He and Section seem to know each other. Section and Harper, a man in his unit, interrogate Woods. A terrorist named Raul Menendez visited Woods and gave him a pendant along with a short message.
All he said was, mi hermana. That's Spanish for sister, dipshit.
Already, we as the player have a ton of questions. Who is this Raul Menendez, and how does he know Woods? Why would he visit and give this old man a pendant and a message? How does Section know Woods? How is Woods alive? I could go on. This scene creates a puzzle with a bunch of missing pieces, and the player immediately wants to start plugging in more pieces. Well, we get an answer to how Woods knows Section pretty quickly when Woods recalls the past. Section is Alex Mason's son. Alex Mason was the protagonist of the first game. Now we're left wondering what happened to Alex, but I'm not going to belabor my point about the game instilling questions. Alex and David are climbing a tree, and Alex seems poised to win the Father of the Year award.
I'm scared. I need help.
You're 7 years old, David. Stop acting like a baby.
I hate you.
Them being in Alaska is a nice touch. In the first game, it's stated that Alex is from Fairbanks, Alaska. After everything that happened in the first game, it makes sense that Alex would retire somewhere he's familiar with. Then Hudson, his former CIA handler, shows up. He asks Mason to come out of retirement to save Woods and his team. David doesn't want to see his father go back, which is understandable. Alex says that this is an exception. He has to go back in for Woods' sake. But I don't think this is the real reason. I think Mason wants to get back into the fray. This is because even after saving Woods, Alex continues working with the CIA. The game doesn't need to outright say it, but it's evident nonetheless. This is a great example of the subtle character work which Black Ops 2 does so well, perhaps better than any other game in the series. Mason deploys to save Woods. We're greeted with the mission debrief screen, where we can select our loadout for the mission. This is a first in the series, and the first of Black Ops 2's innovations. At first, I thought the purpose of this feature was merely to bring multiplayer elements that people like into the single player. But I came to realize it actually integrates incredibly well with the narrative design. Black Ops 2, unlike its predecessors, is designed to be replayed. Many players will want to see how different narrative events play out. If you want to see a different story event, you're not left trudging through the same mission in the exact same way. Taking a shotgun versus a sniper will vary how a mission plays and keep things interesting. The CIA has been backing a revolutionary leader in Angola named Jonas Savimbi. He led the fight for independence from Portugal in the 70s, but he's now embroiled in a civil war. He's the anti-communist leader versus the MPLA, the more communist-leaning faction. Since it's the 80s, the CIA is naturally backing Savimbi in this fight. I got this info from a cursory Google search, so I'm no expert, but the way Black Ops 2 weaves historical events seamlessly into its narrative is impressive, just like its predecessor. It gives this story a weight of realism and authenticity that immerses you. Mason fights with Savimbi and his men. The mission opens with a man burning alive in a vehicle, with Mason unable to break him out. It sets the stage for the Civil War being a bloody, brutal conflict. Savimbi's men report Wood's location after we've helped them fight off the MPLA. Mason hops into a chopper with Hudson. Woods takes a break from this story to recall his apparent death in Black Ops 1. The grenades didn't explode as near to him or Kravchenko as Mason thought, so both men are still alive. Kravchenko came to first, and he captured Woods. He was MIA while Mason thought him dead. Woods eventually broke out and was recovered by Americans. The mission proceeds with Mason and Hudson en route to rescue Woods after his second capture. Honestly, the logistics of Woods confused me when I first played, so I want to repeat myself to make it crystal clear. In this mission, we're not rescuing Woods from Kravchenko after he went MIA. Woods made it back from Nam. He got captured again on a new separate mission from the CIA. Hudson and Woods capture a boat and fight off the MPLA. This is a really cool set piece as Mason has to swap between various machine guns to fend off incoming boats. If he fails, enemy soldiers board the boat. It's very dynamic, and it's a sign of Black Ops 2's commitment to innovation and freshness, even with its set pieces. When the coast is clear, they pull Woods out of a shipping container. The conditions are horrible to say the least. Woods is emaciated and can't even speak. Their boat gets destroyed, so they have to escape on foot, avoiding enemy soldiers. Mason, in the hopes of securing their evac, sneaks up on a young radio operator. The operator is speaking with Kravchenko. So Mason and Woods' nemesis is still around and in action. Mason holds the operator hostage as he's discovered by enemies. The operator, though, is a daring, unhinged man. In fact, he's Raul Menendez, the game's antagonist. He unpins a grenade and tosses it, unleashing chaos. He seems uncaring that one of his fellow soldiers dives on the grenade. Cold, calculating, and reveling in chaos. We get flashes of Menendez's character here. He turns on Mason and strikes. And in the scuffle, Mason shoots out his eye. Mason bails, and he flees with Hudson and Woods. They make it to the beach, and Savimbi comes to their rescue. The mission is a success as the three men make it out alive. But current-day Woods recalls Mason's encounter with Menendez again.
That's how it started. Your old man tries to kill Menendez. Menendez wants payback, even if it takes decades. Menendez, back then, was a big fish in a small pond. He made his cake, running a drug cartel out of Nicaragua. It was a hand-me-down. The CIA smoked his old man. Old Cyclops is pretty pissed at America.
Here we see Menendez's biggest personality trait, his unrelenting hunger for revenge when he's wronged. Also, we learn that the CIA killed his father. How would you feel if your dad was killed by the CIA and then that same CIA came back and took out your eye? His animosity is evident. Then Woods turns his attention to the current day. We get insight into the world situation and a hint of why David Mason and his team are visiting Woods.
Rare earth elements. Whole fucking world runs on this shit. Who controls all of it? China. So while corporate America is kissing China's ass.
Now the mysterious Cortes Diaz social network has crowdsourced simultaneous protests in both Iran and North Korea. Never seen in public, who really is the leader of Cortes Diaz? He's known only as Odysseus.
Odysseus? My ass. Raul fucking Menendez.
asshole.
Black Ops 2 spins a pretty complex geopolitical narrative, incorporating social media, the importance of rare resources to current technology, and how China's hold over those resources impact government as well as corporate relations. In the same way that Black Ops 2 incorporates past events into its story, it also ties real-world concerns and forward projections into the near-future narrative. And at the heart of it all lies Raul Menendez. It's an incredibly ambitious narrative, and I think we see some of the cracks start to show as the next mission begins. David Mason and his team infiltrate a compound filled with Cortes D soldiers. They hope to discover what Raul Menendez is after. While scouting out the compound, we get exposition about Menendez and the conflict.
How many followers does Cortes D have right now? What, 1 billion people?
Try 2 billion. You'll never believe their leader's a terrorist. They think Menendez is their savior.
My problem with this is that there's a lot of telling going on and not much showing. Pretty much everything we've learned about this future world has been merely told to us by a character. We haven't really seen or experienced any of it ourselves. We hear that Menendez is a threat and a terror in the current day, but we haven't seen it. We're told he has this huge following that's 1/3 of the planet, but we haven't seen it aside from a second or two clip from a news station. We're told what's going on, but we don't experience it. We've learned everything secondhand. It leads to a disconnect between you and the characters and a detachment from the central conflict. This gets remedied later in the game, but it's definitely noticeable here. I think this is a direct result of the game's ambition. Once again, the story is juggling a past narrative that's weaved through historical events and a future narrative that's tying in real-world fears. We haven't even gotten into the branching narratives yet. The game just doesn't have the time to establish the future setting in as robust a fashion as if the game entirely took place in the future. And I think all things considered, the sacrifice is worth it. But I think it just goes to show that Black Ops 2's great ambition comes with some sacrifices, and there are a few more of those throughout the game. Not long after Section and his team reach the base, the action begins. The future setting affords Black Ops 2 freedom with introducing more enemy types. In this mission, for instance, there are cloaked enemies in addition to the regular grunts. The best way to counter the cloaked enemies is to use a special weapon sight like the millimeter scanner or to disable their suits via an EMP grenade. There's a nice interplay between various enemies and futuristic tools and weapons. You can also do things like hack turrets or even get a camouflage suit of your own. The combat in 2025 is familiar, but the advanced technology adds a significant level of variety and even some gameplay depth by expanding the player's options. When I returned to the past missions, I found myself missing the increased capabilities and options in the future missions. So with all that said, I think Black Ops 2 does a great job of using gameplay to reinforce the setting while also retaining the Call of Duty identity. Section and his team fight through the facility and come across the scientists they're looking for. They find out what Menendez is planning, at least part of it.
And what is, Menendez's interest in you, buddy?
They brought me here to process the Solarium. It's a new, rare earth element that will render all existing microchip technologies obsolete. Rumors around the lab were that Menendez plans to use it as a basis for a massive cyber attack. I heard talk of something called Karma. It may be the name for the cyber weapon.
Menendez wants to hack something. The question is what he's planning on attacking. Fortunately, Section and his team bag the Solarium, so Menendez can't use it. Section asks one of his men, Salazar, about why Menendez hates them all so much. Salazar explains.
As a boy, he witnessed the country's rape and murder his people. In 1972, there was a colossal earthquake. His family lost everything. A year later, the only thing he ever loved, his sister Josefina, was crippled in a fire. The Menendez cartel was all but untouchable, so the CIA took out Raul's father in a US-sanctioned assassination.
I mean, yeah, if I was Menendez, I would hate the CIA and the US by extension too. One thing to note about this scene is Salazar's passion. He grew up in Nicaragua during Menendez's rise to power, so he can understand Menendez's point of view better than anyone. However, even with that in mind, there's a lot of sympathy in his tone for Menendez. It's not something I picked up on when first playing through the game, but looking back, it's definitely a hint towards what's to come. Menendez started running guns in Afghanistan, so the CIA sent a team including Woods and Mason to go get him. This is where our next mission takes place. Woods recalls these memories while sharing a picture of himself and Alex with David. There's a lot of joy and nostalgia in his voice. We see this continue throughout the story. Woods is a man stuck reminiscing in the past. It's some of Black Ops 2's best character work. The mission in Afghanistan takes place during the Soviet-Afghanistan War in the 80s. Mason and Woods briefly discuss the shifting alliances in the conflict.
You reckon we can trust the Chinese?
We can't here. They've been supporting the Mujahideen same as us.
Right now they're allied with China. Tomorrow they might not be, as their shared goals diverge. We're not given much more context about this war, aside from that we're with the Afghans and against the Russians. This neatly puts the player in a similar headspace to Mason. We have a job to do here. The larger scale of the conflict is for someone else to think about. It's above our pay grade. The lack of context is intentional. It matches the war in Angola, where we also weren't given much information about either side. The ambiguity establishes a moral grayness. I mean, how do we know we're really on the right side here? There's a lot of political gamesmanship and strategy here, as Woods alludes to. The game doesn't provide the context to decide. I'm not trying to make a real-world political point here. More so, what I think this ambiguity helps reestablish from a storytelling perspective is Menendez's point of view. He sees the US as malignant meddlers. We're placed into these conflicts without knowledge to decide whether we're doing good or harm, which then forces us to contend with Menendez's view. It's a good example of how you can leave information out to enhance a story. Woods and Mason ride out on horseback in a pretty freaking cool segment. Black Ops 2 has a versatility that just about no other COD games can match. You go from using invisibility suits to charging on horseback with a rifle. The CIA helps the Mujahideen fend off a Russian offensive. During the fight, they come across none other than Kravchenko. Woods recalls how Mason's brainwashing seems to have subsided, but every once in a while, Woods caught Mason speaking to Reznov. His programming, it seems, was very embedded. We see this play out in the next scene. Woods and Hudson interrogate Kravchenko, and Mason starts to see the numbers again. He tries to resist the urge to kill Kravchenko, as his programming had instilled so deeply in him. The player has to rapidly tap a button to resist. In a prior Call of Duty game, failure to do so would result in a mission failure and a restart. Not so in Black Ops 2. If the player doesn't resist, then Mason will shoot Kravchenko in the head and the story will continue. This is our first branching story moment in the game, and it can come as a surprise. The game doesn't indicate that this is a branching moment, nor does it really indicate that there are even branching narrative choices in the first place. The story tracker records what choices you make throughout the game, but up until this point it just records events in the story, so you could be mistaken for thinking it's purely a story summary screen. This story moment in particular doesn't have huge ramifications on the plot. If you resist the temptation, Kravchenko reveals a mole in the CIA, which later dialogue reflects. If you fail to resist, well, you never get this intel. Either way, Kravchenko dies. Hudson will take him out if you don't. This moment establishes a pattern that the branching choices follow. It's not always clear in the moment whether something you're presented with is a branching moment or not. After this, we're introduced to another one of Black Ops 2's innovations, side missions. Throughout the course of the story, additional missions pop up that the player can take on. They aren't required for completion, but if you want the better ending, you'd better do them. The missions have an expiration date. They become unavailable after a certain point in the story. Gameplay in these side missions is markedly different from the campaign. They infuse real-time strategy elements into the gameplay. You're able to command troops around the battlefield and swap which unit you're controlling as needed. The missions are short and the objectives are simple, whether it be defending points or taking down targets. In fact, maps from the multiplayer mode are reused for these levels, which I actually don't mind at all. It creates a cohesion between the single player and multiplayer, which I appreciate. So there's gameplay variety, and while I can't say it's to my personal tastes, I appreciate the effort. Some of these missions can get pretty intense too. In the first FOB mission, I had to make a desperate last stand as hordes of enemy forces converged on the final objective I had to protect. That was the definite highlight for me. But I think from a story perspective, what these side missions accomplish is adding a sense of scale to the story. It's not just David Mason and his team in this fight. There are grand battles happening, and these FOB missions convey that broader conflict through the litany of drones and soldiers you control. Okay, back to the main story. David Mason and Harper box each other, and Mason has flashbacks to the night his father died. There's a shadowy man, but Mason doesn't recognize him. He doesn't know what it means, but he's determined to put together the pieces that Woods gave him. They return to their interview with Woods. Kravchenko gave them the intel they needed to find Menendez. He's being offered up on a silver platter by Manuel Noriega, the commander of the Panamanian Defense Forces and essential ruler of the country. From the images that flash on the screen, Noriega doesn't seem like the greatest guy in the world. He doesn't exactly seem to treat his people justly. Woods doesn't seem too pleased with the decision in retrospect.
So, CIA, in their infinite wisdom, they sign off on the deal. The White House, they cut a check for $1 million and everybody takes a victory lap.
This is another instance of the moral grayness I discussed earlier. In addition, it's a bit of foreshadowing for what lay ahead. Noriega's men move in on Menendez. Perspective switches to Menendez's point of view. He's calm and he's at peace. This is the only time we see him in such a state throughout the game. He's in his sister Josefina's room. By his body language, we can tell that he cares for her deeply. His peace is disrupted when Noriega's men bust in and sedate him. Mission accomplished, it seems. Unfortunately not. Noriega's a snake, and he double-crosses the Americans by turning Menendez loose. Here we see just how unhinged Menendez can be. He nearly kills Noriega, the man who freed him, in a blinding rage. One of the craziest gameplay segments in the game follows. Menendez cries out for his sister, desperate to rescue her as he goes on a rampage of pure rage. Gameplay has used a great effect here to illustrate his mental state. The screen has a red haze, and speed lines etch the corner of the screen whenever Menendez dashes forward. The game too starts you out with close-range weapons, so Menendez has to charge at his opponents. Whenever you do so, he screams in rage. Menendez here feels less like a man and more like a turbulent force of nature unleashed. He reaches his sister's hallway just as the CIA barges in through the opposite door. Then a grenade bounces into Josefina's room. Menendez dives into it. Woods reflects on the moment and of his time in captivity.
I had no idea she was there, David. I just saw Menendez and I lost my shit.
Frank, you don't lose your shit. What the fuck did Menendez do to you in Angola?
Menendez, he wanted to know what the CIA had on him. He tortured my men in front of me. Thought I'd break. One by one, I watched my team die, then he dumped us in a tin can and locked the door. Left me in there for weeks. So yeah, the next time I saw Menendez, I lost my shit. What the fuck would you do?
Wood's tone here reveals a lot. When talking about Josefina, you hear the regret still lingering in his voice. Likewise, at the end, the anger he feels towards Menendez is still raw. By the focus on Menendez's past, it's evident by this point that Menendez is not a man who's moved past it. But by the same token, Woods is a man defined by the past as well. You can tell that he spends a lot of time thinking about these moments and spends a lot of time looking back. We relive these same events, this time from Mason's perspective. Woods communicates his discomfort with working alongside the cartel.
I ain't keen on fighting alongside these bastards.
Trust me, Woods. The cartel boys are hardcore. You're gonna be glad they're here.
It's that moral grayness again. Working alongside the cartel makes you consider whether we're doing the right things here. These little moments sprinkled throughout the game lend Menendez credence. As Mason fights through the complex, there's a CIA memo you can discover. This links Menendez with the CIA, and it helps explain some later events in the game. It's another narrative branch, albeit a subtler one, as it only changes some dialogue. Woods comes face to face with Menendez, and he goes berserk. He tosses the grenade, and Mason tries to stop him. The explosive goes off course. They observe the wreckage in the room. Menendez's sister, an innocent, is dead. Hudson wants to scrub this one from the books. This mission never happened. They think Menendez is dead too, but the Panama forces leave with the body. Given Noriega's treachery, it's presumed that they let Menendez go.
We let the PDF walk off with the body. And now he's back. He's pretty pissed off, too.
They sure can't kill my old man. Somebody already beat him to it a long time ago.
The death of Menendez's sister explains his desire for revenge and retribution, but there's still evidently more to this story. Woods knows, but David doesn't quite recognize it yet. I do want to quickly mention the game's pacing here. We're 4 missions in and 3 of them have taken place in the past. While this is great at building up interest in the past narrative, The current day storyline feels a bit disconnected. It lacks a sense of momentum. Fortunately, that starts to shift in the next mission. One of the CIA's undercover agents for Reed has intel on Menendez's second-in-command, DeFalco. He's been sighted in Pakistan, the same location where the US has lost a recon drone. David Mason thinks there's a link with Karma, Menendez's cyber weapon. Karma might have taken the drone out. The SEALs decide to pay DeFalco a little visit. But before that, Harper suggests boxing to throw off some steam. He says something that triggers Mason, and he has a flashback.
Come on, go suffer with me.
What did you just say? Come suffer what?
These flashes I'm getting. Die. I know I was kidnapped the night my father died, but I could never see. It was Menendez.
We have another revelation. Menendez is the one who kidnapped David. This leaves us with a whole bunch of questions. How did David get kidnapped? What happened that night? Maybe, most puzzlingly, why didn't Woods tell David about this? What's he hiding? Black Ops 2 isn't quite as mystery-focused as its predecessor, especially when it comes to the later chapters. Nonetheless, when it comes to mystery, Black Ops 2 employs the same playbook as its predecessor to great effect. When there's a revelation, it's always followed by more questions that keep the player engaged and hungry for yet more answers. It's really well done. David and his team head for DeFalco. The mission starts off action-heavy. There's a monsoon that verges on the apocalyptic. Throughout the level, you witness the devastation this monsoon has caused. Debris and ruins litter the environment, and bodies float in the water by the dozen. This is some really nice environmental storytelling that creates contrast with the upcoming mission. David and Harper find Menendez, and they spy on him as Menendez makes his way through the facility. DeFalco and Menendez meet up. While eavesdropping, we get bits and pieces of intel. It's actually possible to fail the surveillance objectives after the very first one. If you fail, you miss out on learning that Menendez is allied with Tian Zhao, the chairman of the Strategic Defense Coalition. This in turn blocks out a Strike Force mission to assassinate him. It's another example of Black Ops 2's variety and branching narrative. Failing mission objectives doesn't necessarily result in a game over screen, but rather can result in cascading narrative effects. But perhaps the best example of the variety and branching narratives is coming up very soon. Besides the intel on Zhao, David and Harper don't learn a whole lot before they're burned by Menendez.
Not only am I aware of the infiltration, I engineered it.
It seems like their enemy not only knew of their presence, but engineered it. This line struck me as your typical bad guy, I knew all along type of line, but there are some interesting things going on here. First, there's a question of how Menendez knew the SEALs were here. He's not truly omnipotent after all. Well, if you've made the right choices throughout the game, you'll know that Menendez has historically had contacts in the CIA. With his reemergence, it makes sense that he still has people in the US government he can tap into. Near the end of the game, it becomes evident who his current mole is. It's neat how the game has a built-in justification, but it's one that the player may not even be aware of if they don't have the requisite intel. Secondly, there's the question, why would Menendez not only enable, but engineer the SEALs into eavesdropping him? Menendez is playing at a higher level than his enemies, and the disastrous consequences of this will come. The SEALs make their escape. During the high-octane getaway, the game delivers its most novel and impactful narrative choice. At least it was both of these things to me. You're driving with Harper in the gunner seat. A fuel pipe bursts into flames above you. If you avoid the flames, Harper makes it through scot-free. But if you fail to avoid the flames, Harper gets burned by them. His face is then disfigured for the rest of the game. When I first played this campaign all those years ago, I had no idea there was a choice here. I wasn't paying attention, so I drove right through the flames. I was shocked when Harper's face got scorched. For the rest of the game, I had to look at him and know I caused his injuries, and I felt bad about it. A lot of games have choices and consequences, but most of the time there is some level of deliberateness to your choices. Even if you don't know you're confronted with a narrative choice, you're usually making some action intentionally that causes it. I've made decisions that have helped allies, and I've made decisions that have hurt allies, but I can't think of another game where I hurt an ally due to my own sheer carelessness. Something that was utterly completely avoidable. You don't gain anything out of Harper being injured, it's just a pure mistake. Games, even narrative games, don't explore the idea of slip-ups and errors very often, and it was powerful to me. I wish it was something games explored more often, because, well, our lives are full of mistakes, aren't they? Things we wish we could take back. It's why when I think about narrative choices across video games, this moment with Harper is one of the very first I think of. Okay, my sermon is over. I just really appreciate this branching path. Continuing on. Burned Harper or not, at the end of the mission, he and Mason encounter Chairman Zhao. When the SEALs say they're after Menendez, Zhao leaves them alone, because he's officially after the terrorists too. But if you successfully got the intel earlier, you know that he's secretly in league with Menendez. Mason pores over their intelligence intel with his team. They discover a logo that they link to Colossus, a floating island resort. There, they believe, is the key to finding Karma. They infiltrate the resort, using cover that Farid created for them. They spend some time walking through this floating paradise and admiring it. Salazar isn't super enthusiastic about it all.
It's an automated system. It's triggered by your biometric ID.
We're all going to hell, man. No wonder Menendez rallies so much support.
He sees Colossus as a prominent example of opulence, excess that the rich burn their money on while the rest of the world suffers. The environmental storytelling I mentioned earlier comes into play here. The last mission was nearly apocalyptic, depicting death and suffering through a terrible environmental disaster. This is contrasted with the opulence and excess in this mission. It paints a picture of a world suffering, while those with means are sectioned off in their own airborne paradise. As Salazar says, Menendez's support amongst the disenfranchised makes sense, and the game communicates this best through the environment. Mason and his team do some sneaking, courtesy of a spider drone, but their cover is blown pretty quickly and the mission devolves into a shootout. They make it to the Colossus database, and they make an interesting discovery. Karma isn't a weapon, it's a woman. Chloe Lynch. Menendez wants her for his plan. DeFalco and his goons are after her already. Mason and his guys go after her. The mission culminates in a chase through the resort. This is another branching narrative moment. You either kill DeFalco and recover Chloe before he reaches an escape chopper, or you fail. The choice has ramifications on the game's ending, so I'll talk more about it later. David Mason wants the rest of the story from Woods, so he returns to the retirement home and asks what happened that night he was kidnapped. Frank continues the story.
About a year later, he shows up in Panama with that piece of shit Noriega. That's the last straw for the CIA. The orders come down from George H.W. for a snatch and grab. So your dad and I, we go in. What a shit show.
Woods and Alex Mason meet with McKnight, and they pick up the materials to smear Noriega's name. This doesn't make sense to Woods. He thinks they should just kill Noriega. Something is off. When they leave, a group of locals vandalize their vehicle. Here again, the morality of the CIA's actions is brought into question. The locals don't exactly seem happy. Woods reiterates the bad feeling he had about the mission. We as the player have a great sense of dread. We know disaster is going to follow. It's only a matter of how. The mission kicks off and Hudson is absent from comms. It's very strange coming from him. Nonetheless, the mission continues on. At the beginning, everything seems to be going to plan, aside from losing the element of surprise early on. They fight to Noriega and plant the incriminating evidence in his motel. Noriega, though, seems cool as a cucumber. I will say the game's animators did a bang-up job of making him look as smug and insufferable as humanly possible. Hudson calls in. The mission has changed. They're to deliver Noriega for a prisoner exchange.
The mission was snatch and grab. The fucking Hudson gets on the radio. Says that Noriega is not the mission. It's a handoff. He's a prisoner swap. And right fucking then I should have known. Like, right then and there. I should have known right then and there. Like, what the fuck is wrong with me? The fuck?
Just take it easy, man. Just take it easy.
Fucking Hudson. I should have smoked him in Nam.
This is my favorite Woods moment in the game. The performance here is just devastating, and it manages to convey so much. This has been something eating away at Woods for decades. It's something he blames himself for, and it's something he has clearly thought about over and over and over again. When he gets the chance to talk about it, the pent-up rage over those years of regret can't help but bubble up. It's some of the best character work in the series, and this level isn't done with brilliant character moments. At the time, Mason and Woods aren't too keen on the new objective, but what are they going to do? They don't know any better. They escort Noriega to the meetup point. Along the way, that unsettling feeling of something being wrong only grows, amplified by current-day Woods' regret. Noriega asks for a weapon, and Hudson demands that this request be met. It seems like Noriega has something over him, or at least somebody does.
Noriega's a puppet. We're all just puppets.
This puppets line is great foreshadowing. They manage to get Noriega to the rendezvous point, but then yet again plans change. Woods moves to an overwatch point, and a prisoner is brought out. Hudson tells us that the prisoner is none other than Raul Menendez, and that now is our chance. Hudson orders us to kill him. Here we're presented with another narrative choice, although it may not seem like it. Where Woods shoots the prisoner will determine whether he lives or dies. If you use your Call of Duty instincts and go for a headshot, well, the prisoner is going to die. But if you go for body shots, he'll live. This will impact the ending of the game, and I'll explain more then. Noriega looks way too chummy about his former pal dying, and soon we discover why. The prisoner was no other than Alex Mason. We've shot our best friend. Noriega played us, Hudson played us, and finally Menendez played us. The man himself emerges, blowing out both of Woods' knees and crippling him before knocking him out. David Mason reels from the revelation. His dad's killer was Frank. No wonder his old guardian didn't want to talk about it. When Woods awakes, he finds himself in a basement with a young David Mason, Hudson, and Menendez. This makes Hudson's treachery a bit more palatable. By betraying Mason and Woods, he was only trying to save a child's life. Menendez says that one more person needs to die. What follows is one of the most powerful character moments in the series. I told you that this level wasn't done with them.
Woods, I can't. I have 2 kids. They... Fuck! Okay, me! Do it! Do it!
What makes this work so well is our history with Hudson. Throughout this game and the first, we've only really seen one side of him. He's a smooth, cool killer, your quintessential CIA agent. All business, unafraid to kill and unafraid to die, seemingly unfazed by everything and only caring about the mission. In Hudson's last moments, we see who he really is. He indeed is a man who values his own life. He is scared of dying like everyone else. He has a family to go back home to, just like Alex had, and in his fear, he asks Woods to die in his place. But after this glimmer of vulnerability, he finds his courage and he sacrifices himself for Woods. Courage is only valuable if it's overcoming fear. Sacrifice is truly meaningful when someone is valuing what they're giving up. In Hudson's last moments, we see not an elite CIA agent, we see a man. And this glimpse into Hudson's humanity is really moving to me. Menendez proceeds to kill him, in one of the most graphic and brutal deaths in the series. After the showcase of Hudson's humanity, his death hits extra hard. Menendez then leaves, leaving David and Woods alive to suffer. David is still reeling from the story, but he doesn't blame Woods. He understands that Woods is a victim just as much as him. Amidst the news, his resolve to take down Menendez only strengthens. With the help of Chloe, or a CIA nerd depending on if she was captured by DeFalco or not, David puts together that Menendez is planning an attack on June 9th, the abolition of slavery day. Which, by the way, the cyber guy's actual credit is CIA nerd, which I find really funny. Admiral Briggs has also tracked Menendez to Yemen, and he orders Mason and his team to get the terrorists right away. Mason detects a trap, but Briggs overrides him. He calls upon Fareed, the CIA double agent who has been helping us so far. In the next mission, we start in his shoes. This gives us an opportunity to speak with Menendez up close and personal. The tension here is really high. Menendez gives off definite vibes that he suspects Fareed is a mole. As Fareed, you feel like a mouse at the whims of a sinister cat who's playing with its food. Mason and his forces attack. Menendez is ready for it though. As David says earlier, this is a trap. Menendez splits from Fareed and tells him to meet at the rendezvous point. Fareed is put in a bad spot. He has to fight through his own allies to preserve his cover. At the rendezvous point, Menendez shoots down Harper's aircraft and captures him. Menendez then hands Fareed a pistol and tells him to prove his loyalty. Here we're given a direct choice. Kill Harper and protect your cover, or try to take a shot at Menendez and end his schemes right here and now. This choice is interesting because there is a right tactical decision. Harper urges you to kill him, and he's right to do so. Fareed likely can't get the shot off and he'll be blowing his cover. If Fareed goes for Menendez, he very predictably gets shot down. Harper knows Fareed's life is more vital to the mission. And what's interesting is that the game follows through with this. If you want the best story outcome, you have to kill Harper here. But that means losing Harper, and he'll no longer be at your side throughout the rest of the game. Harper is my favorite of the modern era side characters. However, I still wish we had gotten more time with him before this moment to make it even more impactful. Because of how past-oriented the first half of the game is, we've really only gotten a handful of missions with him. But it's simply one of the drawbacks of the narrative structure. We just don't get as much time with the modern day characters. Nonetheless, Harper is a naturally charismatic and likable guy, so I do think this moment is still effective. His absence is really felt, which adds a lot of weight to this choice. The game is essentially presenting a choice here between your friends or your mission. The fact that it follows through with the consequences is what makes it work so well. Mason arrives on the scene to either living Fareed or Harper. He continues the pursuit for Menendez, and surprisingly he captures the terrorists, but Menendez doesn't seem all too disappointed by it. Remember, this is all a trap, and in the next mission we see the consequences. At the opening of Odysseus, we're given a cutscene between Briggs and Secretary Petraeus. Depending on your choices up until this point, mainly whether we've killed the upstart Tianjiao for them, China has either agreed to cooperate with us or is hostile. Either way, Mason and Salazar interrogate Menendez. During this, Menendez goes on a diatribe.
It was taken from me. Do you know what that feels like yet? An American torched the warehouse. For insurance money, $11,000. That was the value they placed on her life. She was the reason for me to live. What about you, David? What drives you? Is it me? Einstein once said that the economic anarchy of capitalism is the real source of evil. Your father and his people took Josefina from me. Pues, tu papá está muerto. Your father is dead. And his people. Finished.
This is a great moment that showcases Menendez's true motivations as much by what he doesn't say as by what he says. Menendez is finally face to face with Mason once more, a reunion he's waited years for. And what does he talk about? He talks about his sister almost exclusively. He mentions capitalism once before the conversation goes right back to his sister. It's exactly as Frank Wood said. For Menendez, this really is all about his sister. When in public, he's pushing the mission to Cortes D, the destabilization of the great powers and the rising of disenfranchised countries. However, even though I'm sure Menendez believes his rhetoric to an extent, it's not what he truly cares about. Cortes D is a tool to him. It's his means of getting revenge on Woods and his allies by taking everything they love. David Mason is one of the few who gets to see through the veil. He used to suffer with Menendez. Cortes D attacks the aircraft carrier. When Mason looks away, somehow Menendez escapes and takes Salazar hostage. It doesn't make sense, which Mason comments on. Before he can ponder what happened, he's knocked out, and when he awakens, it's a scramble to take back the ship. He's too late. He tries to warn Briggs about rebooting the carrier's defenses, but he doesn't reach him in time. When the system is down, Menendez breaks into the control room. There's a spike of tension when a Cortes D soldier mentions Salazar. He's a double agent. The following scene is very dynamic, and it changes depending on the player's actions up until this point. If DeFalco is alive, he'll be with Menendez. If Chloe was rescued, she'll be here, and the same goes for if Fareed is alive. The crux of this scene, however, comes down to Chloe. The end of the game will change based on if she lives through this. For that to happen, she obviously needs to be here, but Fareed also needs to be alive. Salazar or DeFalco will try to kill her, but Fareed will save her. This reinforces Fareed being the right tactical choice to save from earlier. As I said, the game follows through with the importance of that choice. Any other combination in this scene will result in Chloe's death. Speaking of choices, we're presented with another one here. What's interesting is we get this choice while playing as Menendez. The player gets to decide whether to kill or spare Admiral Briggs. To be honest, this choice falls a bit flat for me. Salazar wants Menendez to spare Briggs because he's a good man. However, this rings hollow when Salazar just killed a bunch of people who, as far as we know, are good people too. Likewise, it just doesn't seem much in Menendez's character to spare Briggs. When I think of Menendez, I don't think of mercy. It seems like he would just kill Briggs and be done with it. He's still a threat after all, which is proven by what happens if you keep Briggs alive. He manages to save the aircraft carrier. If you kill him, then the Obama falls. I think this choice could have been removed from the game, and the Obama's fate left to whether the player had successfully won over China as an ally. It's not a terrible choice by any means, and it doesn't mar the game or anything like that. It just feels a bit superfluous. With the deck clear, Menendez uploads a virus into the carrier with a Solarium chip. This is what Menendez was really after. He wants to be captured so he could get close enough to the carrier to upload the virus. Things just went from bad to worse. Section goes after Menendez. Salazar has surrendered without a fight. I'll take a moment to talk about Salazar's betrayal. Overall, I think it's handled well and it makes sense in the context of the story. Salazar's dialogue throughout the game demonstrates a clear sympathy for Menendez. His disloyalty also explains how Menendez had so much inside information on Mason's plans. It's been established that Menendez has plans in the US government too. Everything lines up well logically. So intellectually it works for me. But I will say that I didn't have much of an emotional reaction to his betrayal, not like Shepard from Modern Warfare 2. I guess it comes down to that I never really trusted Salazar. Not that I distrusted him either. I just don't think he had enough of a screen presence to feel much one way or the other. The story just has so much going on that unfortunately I don't think there was much time to flesh him out like some of the other side characters in the series. Mason encounters Salazar in the hangar bay. What happens next depends on if Harper is alive. If Harper has survived, he'll kill Salazar. If not, Mason orders him to be taken prisoner. It's a good example of how some choices in Black Ops 2 have cascading consequences. The decision of whether to kill or spare Harper has already had multiple downstream effects. It makes this story feel very fluid and dynamic. Unfortunately, Menendez gets away. David Mason requests to protect the president because he believes her to be a target. Depending on whether you've won China as an ally, you'll either get a cutscene of Premier Chen thanking the president for her protection, or a cutscene of the Premier chastising her for a bunch of US drones heading for his country. Which is fair, to be honest. Mason's hunch proves to be correct. Cortes D strikes their aircraft and it goes down. Mason needs to escort the president out of the city. It was this mission that helped me pinpoint why I like David so much. This is a guy who's been through a lot in his life. He has a dad who, by all indications, was absent often and harsh when he was around. David was kidnapped and saw his father's body while a stranger tortured and killed his father's friends. That's enough to mess anyone up for multiple lifetimes. But despite what David's been through, he manages to just be a normal, decent guy. He's an apt leader and he keeps a cool head, despite what Menendez has done to him. I find him aspirational and an easy guy to root for because of how he overcomes adversity. This is my favorite level in the game. Los Angeles is in the midst of destruction, with an army of drones swarming the sky. The level manages to communicate the chaos, confusion, and devastation Menendez's hacking of the drones has created. Mason manages to escort President Boswell safely out of the city. They manage to locate the source of the drone signals. They formulate a counterattack with Mason spearheading it. They raid Menendez's compound. Time is running out as America and China face imminent destruction from his drones. After some white-knuckle fighting, Mason and his team reach the control room, but they quickly find out that they can't access the system. Menendez broadcasts live, and he reiterates the suffering of the world at the hands of the great superpowers. Then instead of using the drones to attack, Menendez does something unexpected. He destroys all of the drones, crippling the US military. He urges Cortes D to rise and strike while its enemy is wounded. That's not good, but there are immediate matters to attend to. Menendez is still on the island, and unlike on the Obama, it's not too late to capture him. Mason manages to catch up to him, and he takes out Menendez's goons in a cool slow-mo segment. If DeFalco is alive in your campaign, this is where you'll take him out. If Harper is still alive, he'll be here too, although he'll get injured when the ground gives way under him and Mason. Here we have the final choice in the game. Do you kill or spare Menendez? I think there are valid reasons for Mason to both kill and spare him. The reason to kill is obvious, as revenge for what Menendez has done to him and his loved ones. But sparing Menendez so he's not a martyr for Cortes D also makes sense. So this is a compelling choice from David's perspective. However, I think this moment is even more powerful when you look at Menendez's character. There's a lot going on here, and it brings everything about his character together so well. Menendez wants David to kill him. Menendez says it's so he'll be a martyr for Cortes D, but I don't think that's what it's really about. As I've talked about earlier, Cortes D isn't Menendez's true motivator. Throughout this story, Menendez has an affinity for David. He refuses to kill Mason, but it goes deeper than that. Menendez talks to David almost like a younger brother. I think there's a reason for that. Menendez sees similarities between David and his sister. Both were innocent victims of the men with greater power scheming around them. Menendez is aware of the fact that he's to David what Woods was to his sister. I think there's a part of him that wants justice for David. He wants David to get payback just like Menendez had. So David killing Menendez here would be the perfect end to his grand plan. He said that David would suffer with him, and here's where that suffering would end. He would be providing justice for David for how he had wronged him. At the same time, Menendez's death means ending his own suffering and his longing for his sister. And as the final cherry on top, it means advancing the cause of Cortes D. You as the player decide whether to grant Menendez this ending, but regardless of your choice, the game ends. So let's get into the endings. There are 8 of them and they're contingent on 3 key choices during the campaign. First, whether or not Woods made a kill shot on Mason. Second, whether Karma is alive or not. And third, whether David kills or spares Menendez. I got 3 of these endings. The best ending, arguably the worst ending, and one that lies in between. So, the best ending happens when Alex, Mason, Karma, and Menendez all survive. Karma is able to stop Menendez's virus in its tracks. Menendez rots in jail. Without anything to fuel his movement, it fizzles out. He watches Karma do a TV interview and bangs his head against the monitor in frustration. Lastly, David and Alex reunite. It's sort of an open question of where he was all these decades, but nonetheless, it's a happy ending with Alex encouraging him.
You made me proud that day. I fell. Yeah, but you got back up.
So that's the best ending. There are a few bad endings, but here's arguably the worst. It happens when Karma is dead, David Mason is dead, and Menendez is alive. Without Karma around, nobody can stop the virus. The CIA nerd just doesn't have the chops, I guess.
Ah, it's a piece of piss, this Solarium.
Menendez breaks out of prison and he murders Woods by slitting his throat. With the world in chaos and his mission finally complete, he digs up his sister's grave and burns himself alive. The third ending I got is also pretty bad. Karma is dead, Menendez is dead, and Alex Mason is dead. Once again, nobody can stop the virus, so it runs rampant. Menendez was right about his death. He is a martyr for Cortes D, and his movement grows in light of his death. A grand uprising happens, and the world burns. David visits his father's funeral with Woods, and he decides to retire. So these are the 3 endings I got. The other 5 are mostly just variations, mixing and matching these different events. But the thing about branching endings is that most players only receive 1. Most players don't replay the campaign, so they're not likely to see some, if not most, of these endings. So rather than extensively analyzing each one, I want to take a more comprehensive look at the narrative choices in the game. I find the experience of making these choices, and the general impact they have on the narrative, more interesting than the outcomes themselves. As I talked about at the beginning of the analysis, Black Ops 2 is a big narrative departure for the series, especially when you consider that its predecessor tells one of the best stories in FPS history. Changing up that format is a big risk, and it comes with some trade-offs. You lose out on the preciseness of telling a story because you have to account for variation. It would be difficult to make Harper an integral part of the game's ending, for instance, because he may die halfway through the game for half the players. But I won't go on about this. I think most people understand the inherent trade-offs that come with branching storylines. The question is, in Black Ops 2's case, was this narrative structure worth it? Do these choices feel like an integral part of the game, in line with its themes and the general experience the campaign is aiming for? Or is it a tacked-on addition, an innovation purely for the sake of innovation? Well, as you probably gathered from my analysis so far, I think most of the choices are integrated really well. There's a variety of the choices that make them feel organic and spontaneous. There are black and white choices mixed with hidden decisions like when you shoot Alex Mason. The campaign is dynamic in response to your choices, and there's more carry through the consequences than a lot of other games, even ones that claim to have even more focus on narrative choice. I touched on some of these events, like Harper's scarring, but there are a lot I didn't touch on. For instance, if you lose Chloe to DeFalco, it will open up an additional mission where you can try to rescue her again. And furthermore, there are a lot of subtle changes in cutscenes that I didn't touch on. A lot of the time, dialogue changes or different characters appear depending on your choices. but something can be integrated into a story really well and still feel like a mismatch for the narrative. So does the player's ability to make choices align with the story that Black Ops 2 is telling? This is where I think the true beauty of this narrative lies. The ability to make choices fits so thematically well with the story. Black Ops 2 at its core is a story about the sins of our fathers and how we deal with them. David Mason is our protagonist, but for the first half of the game he's a passive participant. There's a large focus on the past, where David learns about events that he has no control over, yet they're events that he still has to deal with. He's inherited problems that were created by his father and allies. In fact, he's a direct victim of these problems. He's suffered as a child and endured trauma to no fault of his own. But as an adult, he has the power to deal with these problems. He has the ability to deal with the legacy of the past and determine the outcome. He can't change what happened, but he can change the future. We as the player join David on this journey. By being able to step into his shoes and make these decisions, we're even more connected to his character and his newfound agency in the story. Not every choice in the game fits into this template, but I think it's still a large part of the thematic framework. So putting it all together, the choices in Black Ops 2 were executed well, but even more critically, the ability to make choices meshes beautifully with the game's central story and themes. With all that said, I consider Black Ops 2's branching narrative a resounding success. So, with all of its ambition, where did Black Ops 2 land? Black Ops 2 took a big risk by entirely changing its narrative structure. There are some drawbacks to this. The pacing, especially at the beginning of the game, is a bit odd, and the current story feels a bit neglected at first. Furthermore, the current day characters like Salazar and Harper don't get quite the time to shine that supporting characters got in other games. However, I think these drawbacks are small compared to the dynamic, unique, and compelling narrative Black Ops 2 spins. The sheer complexity of this story dwarfs the other campaigns, which is why this analysis is so darn long. Black Ops 2 shot for the stars. You can tell that it wanted to be the very best Call of Duty campaign. For me, I guess it's hard to compare Black Ops 2 to its predecessor. They're just two entirely different stories, and they both achieved their goals with the same mastery. And I think the one you prefer really comes down to personal preference. I appreciate Black Ops 2's ambition more than anything else. It's the Call of Duty campaign where I feel like I'll discover something new every single time I play, and that's a special thing. Black Ops is a series that's always pushed the envelope with its storytelling. The original experimented with suspense and the subversion of expectations, delivering one of the best plot twists in all of gaming. Its sequel introduced branching narratives, greatly increasing the scope and complexity of the story. Black Ops 3 continues the tradition of experimenting with its narrative. It does so in a variety of ways, from novel storytelling techniques to the game's very concept and thematic framing. Black Ops 3 takes place in a future with cybernetics, simulations, AI, and grand conspiracies, where nothing is ever as it seems on the surface. Black Ops 1 made us question the protagonist's sanity, but Black Ops 3 makes us question the very nature of reality itself. Did its narrative succeed? In the eyes of most players, it didn't. When the credits start to roll, the overwhelming response from most players is confusion. The story is convoluted to the point that most people don't even know what happened. In fact, Black Ops 3 is considered one of the worst COD campaigns of all time. So, do I think the campaign is the worst? Well, no, but I do think it's the most frustrating. The reason why is that Black Ops 3 had so much potential. There are brilliant ideas throughout this campaign, and the setting is truly fascinating. In fact, there are parts of the story that resonate deeply with me. On top of that, the game truly innovates in the gameplay department, delivering an experience that feels like a sincere evolution for the series. But despite Black Ops 3's brilliant ideas, it falls short in execution. It's possible for a story to become too complicated for its own good, and Black Ops 3's desire to instill a sense of mystery in the player comes at the cost of understanding, and with it, emotional buy-in. So we're going to dive into Black Ops 3's campaign. I'm going to go over the parts I truly love about it, from its setting and ideas to its groundbreaking gameplay. I'll also go over where it goes wrong and what could have changed to make the campaign better. Another note, I'm going to go over the story in terms of how the player initially experiences it. At the end, I'll give my interpretation of the ending as well as what really happened throughout the story. It's a little bit different from the other theories I've read online, so I'm excited to share it. Okay, with all that said, let's dive in. Black Ops 3 starts off with a character creator, a first for the series and the first of the game's innovations. It's a very interesting choice to me. With a character creator, you would assume that the narrative would go in the direction of making the player character a blank slate for the player to graft their identity onto. In many prior campaigns, the player character is silent, so this wouldn't be too big of a shift. However, the player character in Black Ops 3 is actually pretty well defined. They're pretty chatty, more so than even the other Black Ops protagonists during gameplay. In addition, they have a defined moral perspective, often arguing with their comrade Hendricks about the right thing to do.
They leaked classified intel that has allowed our enemies to know exactly where and when to strike. They implicated the CIA in the Singapore disaster. Their actions have destabilized the entire WA. So yes, you bet your ass, I'm okay with this.
The choice of a customizable character in light of this is interesting, and I wonder what the game would have been like with a defined character instead. However, there's a slew of customization and personalization throughout the game, which I'll get more into later, so this falls in line with that. After the player makes their character, the opening cinematic plays. It does a great job of establishing the setting, so I'm just going to let it run.
Human bioaugmentation has become commonplace throughout the developed world.
The sheer scale of this disaster has overwhelmed the authorities.
Superstorms continue to hammer the region, hampering relief efforts.
These are uncertain times. Our future depends upon the choices we make. As populations continue to expand, megacities emerge worldwide.
The extreme conditions have led to a vast exodus of displaced residents.
WA bases were on high alert this morning.
Direct energy air defenses neutralized the attack almost immediately. Protesters and local forces clashed again today, resulting in yet more bloodshed.
Make no mistake, this is a new Cold War.
The world of Black Ops 3 is not a very nice one, and is besieged by problems on all sides. Environmental disasters and expanding populations have led to mass exoduses and growing tensions, which are flaring up in both cold and hot wars. What I also like about this opening is that none of these expository details are mere set dressing. Everything discussed here, from the environmental storms to megacities, are explored throughout the campaign. Jacob Hendricks introduces himself. He's our new commanding officer, and our first mission is a trial by fire. The NRC took the Egyptian Prime Minister hostage, and they intend to punish him as an example for the uprising in Cairo. We as the player don't know who the NRC are yet, but they sound like the bad guys, so that's enough to go off of for now. Hendricks and the player create a distraction before setting off in search of the minister. They reach a security station and they search the camera feeds for their targets. They pass feed after feed of prisoners getting tortured. This is one of our first in-person looks at this futuristic world, and it's a brutal one. This scene does a lot to build the bleakness of the world, and it tells us about our characters. Hendricks and the player character pass over the videos with a certain level of numbness, and they ignore all the prisoners who aren't their target. Torture like this, it seems, is not an abnormal sight to them. They have a certain hardness to the evils of the world. They find their target and go to break him out. They notify Commander John Taylor.
ETA?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. I'll be timing you.
Son of a bitch was never funny.
You sound like the voice of experience.
Trust me, I am.
Black Ops 3 does a really great job of weaving exposition naturally into its dialogue. Here we can tell that Hendricks and Taylor have a history working together, and there's a touch of bitterness in Hendricks' voice about it. When they reach the minister, he begs Hendricks to save the other prisoners.
Khalil was a hero of the Cairo uprising. You know that makes him a valuable asset for their propaganda. They will make an example of him. Fuck! Alright, let's go!
This is another great moment at building Hendricks' character. The way he curses in response to the minister's rationale makes it seem like he's been thinking through the same exact arguments himself. Despite his apparent numbness from earlier, he does want to do the right thing, and this is a pattern that will continue throughout the game. After freeing the other prisoners, they fight through opposition and reach Taylor's team, and well, they're pretty formidable. In fact, they're given an almost superhero introduction, with Diaz doing a ground slam and Taylor doing some gung fu. It establishes right away that these guys are on a different level than us, courtesy of their cybernetic enhancements. Taylor and Hendricks speak, and it's tense.
Nice to see you, Jacob.
You too, John. You look different. You still seeing Rachel?
That didn't work out. That's a pity.
New blood? Gonna take care of him as good as you did me?
That's not funny, man. We still set on our exfil?
Charges are set.
Once again, Black Ops 3 weaves this exposition really naturally into the dialogue, and there's a lot to glean here. Taylor once worked under Hendricks, and the latter seems to have even been a mentor. But things went south between them. Hendricks seemed to fail Taylor somehow, and there's still bitterness in him. In addition, Taylor once saw a woman named Rachel, but no longer. Hendricks, the player, and Taylor's team head for exfil. We see more of their enhancements in action, from super mobility to cloaking systems. Their help feels sorely needed, as the enemy opposition we face is immense. The players put in a position of powerlessness, and you want the enhancements that your allies have. As we fight on, the opposition only becomes more intense. We come across a red smoky haze and a new enemy emerges, the NRC assault robots. Their introduction is ominous, especially if you peer into the smoke cloud with a thermal sight. You see just how many of these things are coming at you. The scene succeeds at instilling a sense of unease in the player. You get the feeling that things are bad, but they're about to get even worse. We catch a moment to breathe, and Hendricks and Taylor argue about what to do next.
Those other hostages we saw, you can get them out.
Not a mission priority.
It may not be a mission priority, but they're still people, damn it! Or have you changed so much that you've forgotten what that feels like?
This is a good contrasting of their characters. Hendricks highly values his morality in doing the right thing, while Taylor is more callous and mission-focused. However, he didn't always used to be that way. You get the sense that this is what caused friction between them. But Taylor isn't heartless. He relents to Hendricks, and his team goes to get the hostages. Even though it's not strictly the mission objective, there is still humanity in him. Meanwhile, Hendricks and the player escort the minister out, but things go south. The ominous sense of dread is finally given reason. The player fails to make it out, and they're left to the NRC and its death robots, while Hendricks watches helplessly. He resorts to Taylor, begging him to help rescue the player. But Taylor can't arrive in time. One of the robots gets a hold of the player, and they're mauled in one of the most ghastly and horrifying scenes in the game. In first person, we see our character get torn, limb by limb. There is something terrible in how soulless and dispassionately the robot moves. It's executing combat code without any of the remorse or emotion that a human would have. This moment too paints a picture of this world we're in. It's a world that's dominated by technological advancements, yet it's a cold, brutal, and heartless place. Taylor reaches the player, and he doesn't sound as worried as you might think. He is convinced that he can patch the player up. With a fade to black, the first mission ends. Overall, I think it's a masterful introduction. We're given adequate background on this futuristic world, and the mission communicates the world's atmosphere and tone, which are the most important parts to nail at this stage. The characters are nuanced and interesting, and we already know a lot about them without exposition feeling ham-fisted. I also love the art direction of Black Ops 3. Its vehicles, weapons, and armor look sleek and properly advanced, but they still have a grounded feel. And if you've seen my other analysis, you know I love nothing if not good art direction. So at this stage in the story, I was fully bought in. This is a world and setup with nearly endless potential. Let's see what the game does with it. But already, things start to get a bit strange with Mission 2. Taylor gives us an update on the player's condition.
Unfortunately, you sustained life-threatening injuries. You're stable, but you got a long way to go.
The player suddenly finds themselves aboard a train with Taylor. Then that train explodes. The player character and probably the actual player are very confused at this point. Taylor provides an explanation.
This isn't real. It can't be. What is happening to me?
Right now, you're in a medically induced coma being prepped for surgery. You've got a new bit of hardware inside your head. It's called a direct neural interface, or DNI. I've got one too. That's how I'm able to communicate with you. Your DNI is what connects your mind with your new body and the larger world around you. We're connected.
The idea for this mission is very novel. In 2054, there was a terrorist attack on a train that the authorities failed to stop. In this simulation, we walk through the events leading up to this attack. Taylor and his team highlight how the original authorities failed, and then they outline an alternative course of action the player can take with the help of their DNI. The contrast between what used to be possible and what is now possible with the DNI does a great job of demonstrating the utility of DNI and its impact on the world. Some important facts about DNI are also provided. With a DNI, a user can tap into and control simple machines like drones, but more complex machinery like the ground units with their interconnected hive line would melt the user's brain. And perhaps most importantly of all, a DNI can be used to worm into another DNI user's brain and tap into their memories. However, this is a deeply traumatic experience that leaves the subject brain dead. It's a moral question. There are a number of these throughout the mission, and it even culminates with one. The player can't stop the train without sacrificing themselves. Taylor hammers home that the DNI may help the player make decisions, but the moral choice is always in their hands.
Your DNI might show you all the options, but only you can decide what you're willing to sacrifice.
There is a running theme in Black Ops 3 about the role of technology with morality. So there are a lot of interesting ideas in this mission. In fact, I think there are a few too many. Let's take a step back and examine it. We have a mission that takes place in a simulation. Not only that, but we're jumping between alternate versions of past events, and these hypotheticals are combined with explanations of what actually happened. Furthermore, we learn about the significance of this attack and the ramifications on the political landscape. Meanwhile, we're being introduced to DNI itself, as well as being introduced to Taylor's entire squad. Frankly, it's just overwhelming. It's too much for most players to take in, especially on a first playthrough, and they're going to be left confused. The mission is emblematic of Black Ops 3's greater problem. The game has a ton of awesome ideas, but it often just runs with them without any regard for taking the player along for the ride too. In a story, there has to be a certain level of consideration for how much information the player can process at once. If the player can't understand what's happening, they're just not going to connect with it. After the player saves the hypothetical day, they wake up. Taylor tells them that everything will be okay. Hendricks too decides to volunteer to get a DNI and be augmented. Why, you might ask? Well, I think it lines up with what we've seen of Hendricks so far. He cares about protecting people. He failed to save one of his soldiers, yet Taylor was able to with all of his enhancements. 5 years pass with Hendricks and the player going on missions together. They never know where they're going next, and they just go with the flow. That all changes when they're sent to Singapore. And Singapore in this world, well, it's a mess.
Local CIA black station's gone dark, set up in the wake of the Singapore disaster. The station was tasked with keeping an eye on the local operations. Since the wall went up and the authorities abandoned evacuation efforts, the place has been pretty much run by the dominant criminal organization, the 54 Immortals.
Pretty soon, Hendricks and the player run into 54 Immortals, and their introduction is brutal. Once again, the world in Black Ops 3 is depicted as a tough, violent place. This scene echoes Taylor's message from the prior mission. Technology doesn't make people better morally, it only enhances their ability to do good or evil. Here, the 54 Immortals have developed, or at least scavenged, explosive collars. They were probably developed as a means of transporting prisoners. The 54 Immortals are putting the technology to evil use, as a means to sadistically kill prisoners. Hendricks has a difficult time watching. The past 5 years haven't dampened his morality. He still wants to do the right thing. Hendricks opens fire, and they begin their mission in earnest. As they fight their way to the CIA black station that went down, they're besieged by not only enemies but superstorms. The player has to anchor down to avoid getting swept away by harsh winds and powerful tides. These superstorms were mentioned in the game's introduction as well as this mission's opening cutscene. I appreciate the carry through of exposition into gameplay. It helps make the world feel more concrete to the player. We've heard about the storms and now we get to experience them firsthand. Now is a great time to talk about gameplay and the various systems that surround it. Black Ops 3 in my opinion is a true evolution of the series' gameplay format. The same base, satisfying gunplay is present that's always been there in this series, but there are a number of additional systems layered on top of it that really bring the gameplay to the next level. The loadout customization from Black Ops 2 returns here, but Black Ops 3 goes even further. Weapons can be leveled up to unlock new attachments, and just like in the multiplayer, it's a satisfying mode of progression here. It simply feels good to finish a mission and see what new guns or attachments you've unlocked. Along with gun level ups, there are tac rig abilities and wildcard perks. Tac rig abilities can really change up the gameplay, especially the wall run module. There is an additional unlock that lets you boost into the air, and this is a genuine game changer. The wildcards unlock new gameplay options too, such as equipping 2 primaries. So these upgrades aren't just superficial, they can genuinely change how you approach missions. But this progression really comes together with the 3 cores you can equip. Each core provides a host of abilities you can use during gameplay. There is the Martial Core, which is melee and traversal focused. There are skills such as Overdrive, which gives you a speed boost, along with a forward melee charge, an invisibility cloak, and so on. Then there's the Chaos Core, which contains skills focused on, well, creating chaos. The abilities are oriented towards stunning and disorienting your enemies, things like short-circuiting robots to make them explode, or overloading your human enemies' senses. Lastly, there's the Control Core. The skills focus on hacking enemies and either hijacking their systems or debilitating them. During combat, you can equip any of the skills with the core you're using. An ability can be used, followed by a very short cooldown. It's hard to express just how many tactical options these skills open up. I think the best way to demonstrate it is through an example. Take this clip. I'm equipped with the Martial Core, my favorite one. I see a wide open lane with enemies, so I use my charge to close the distance and take out a handful of enemies. I quickly realize that I'm in over my head and overwhelmed by the opposition around me. I decide to hunker down until my core recharges. I switch to the cloaking ability, which enables me to retreat to a more secure firing position. This maneuver wouldn't have been possible without 2 Martial Core abilities, the charge and the cloak. If I was using the Chaos Core instead, I wouldn't have been able to do this, and the same goes for if I hadn't unlocked these abilities yet. Throughout the game, you get tokens to unlock and upgrade these abilities, and it's genuinely exciting to do so because they enable entirely new strategies on the battlefield, as I hope my example illustrated. The player has a lot of tools available to them, but what makes this work even better is that the enemy design encourages you to switch up your strategy. There are a variety of enemy types, where some strategies are more effective than others. For instance, with a group of robots, the immolation ability is really effective. However, the ability can't even be used against human troops. With more infantry present, you may want to move around more, and with more stationary targets like turrets, you may want to hack more. On top of this, Black Ops 3 is challenging. I played on the normal mode, and I died as much as playing on hard and difficulty in other campaigns. This difficulty pushes you to lean on your entire tool set instead of just aiming and shooting the entire time. So in summary, the campaign creates a compelling progressive loop, one of the best I've played in a shooter in a while, and it's integrated into a gameplay system that's equally compelling. The replayability of this game surpasses the others. As soon as the credits rolled, I wanted to continue playing for the gameplay's sake. I wanted to play around more with the Control and Chaos cores and upgrade new weapons. The fact I wanted to keep playing is a testament to how well tuned this progression and weapon sandbox is. I've spent so much time talking about the gameplay because, well, I think it's worth talking about. A lot of the discussion around this campaign is purely the story, but I want to emphasize just how darn fun it is to play. Black Ops 3 does so many things right. The gameplay is awesome and it sets up a truly interesting world. It's why I think the game had so much potential. Okay, now back to the story. Hendricks and the player reach their CIA contact, Agent Kane. As far as first impressions go, she's calm and collected, even in the midst of Singapore's chaos. Typical as far as your CIA agent goes. However, there's a touch of tension in their encounter. Prior to the mission's beginning, Hendricks expresses unease with the CIA, and that distrust bleeds through here.
This is a CIA op. This is their safe house.
Glad you remember. I hope you also remember how I feel about the CIA watching over our every move.
Together, they fight through 54 immortal thugs that are looting the black site. When they enter the site, they find something ghastly. The CIA agents have been tortured and killed in a 54 immortals ritual called the Denial of Reincarnation. Just another example of how harsh this world is. But Kane discovers something even more alarming. The data they came to clear has been stolen. The site data syncs worldwide with all the other CIA sites, so there's intel on all of the CIA's operations. If the intel gets out, it could compromise every CIA op and put countless lives in danger. Hendricks is ready to hunt the 54 immortals and get the intel back, but then Kane drops the biggest bombshell.
Who do you think did it? I mean, who else had access to this?
The last recorded operation at this station involved a Winslow Accord Black Cyber Ops unit. It was John Taylor's team.
What? You think they had something to do with these murders?
There's no fucking way, Kane. Look, I know Taylor. There's no way he'd turn on his own.
The mission ends on this cliffhanger. This is the real inciting incident that kicks this story off. The game employs the same mystery storytelling technique as its predecessor. This revelation sparks a multitude of questions. Did Taylor's team do it? If so, why on earth would they? Or is Kane lying? What angle could Kane be playing at? Hendricks is less inclined to believe Kane. When he and the player recoup at base, he expresses his skepticism.
I think our LNO is keeping something back from us.
I think you're being paranoid. I read her file. She's been through some bad ops, heavy situations. Lived through it all. I think she's being straight with us.
I guess we'll see.
The player character, meanwhile, keeps a cool head. They reason that, based on Kane's history, she's not the type to lie. Yet they don't dive headfirst into condemning Taylor either. They're willing to let things play out. The player character inhabits this role throughout the game. They're generally the voice of reason, leveling out the characters around them. With how crazy this world is and how mind-bending it can be at times, the player character serves as an anchor we can hold on to. I actually came to really like the player character in this story. Of course, I'll talk more about their character as we go along. No matter who's behind the killings, one thing is for certain. Hendricks and his allies need to recover the data drives, not only to prevent a catastrophic leak, but also because the drives will contain security feeds that will give them their answer. They need to get close to the Goes, two twins that run the 54 Immortals, and they go through a mutual dealer, Daniel Lee, to do it. Things seem to be going okay with the dealer until the twins themselves show up. They burn the player and Hendricks, and things go belly up. Hendricks authorizes a contingency plan, and assault robots open fire. The dealer is killed along with one of the twins. The player and Hendricks battle 54 Immortals and their allies. The surviving twin flees to a server room in a place called Cloud Mountain. She hopes to upload the drive data and spread it across the world. It's a desperate race, but they manage to reach her, and Hendricks delivers a haymaker to put her down. They try to shut down the transmission, but there's a wrinkle. There's a secondary input to the system that requires a hand authorization. The player character cuts off Go's hand, so they can use both inputs simultaneously. Hendricks has moral compunctions about maiming her, but the player character sees it as necessary. This harkens back to Taylor's message. Despite what advanced technology offers, morality is still a choice. Kane asks Hendricks to interface with the console using his DNI. They need to perform an acceleration to properly wipe everything from the drives. As Sarah Hall mentioned during our training, direct interfacing with DNI presents a risk to the user. Kane warns him that he may not like what he sees while connected. Hendricks is hesitant to trust her, but he sees no other option. The player defends Hendricks as he wipes out the drive. Once the job is done, they flee by traversing across the super trees. These structures provide some fun layouts for combat encounters, but it's also an imaginative setting. The future world of Black Ops 3 is really unique visually. It manages to find that middle ground between offering diverse locations that still manage to feel cohesive visually. There is a sense of intrigue imbued into the environments that makes me want to learn even more about the world. The art direction really is top notch. During the escape, Go wakes up and barks orders to her men. After we just killed her brother and maimed her, she's bound to cause problems in the future. Hendricks and the player make it out, but Hendricks is clearly shaken by whatever he came across while interfacing.
Hendricks, what'd you see?
I saw bullshit. That's what I saw.
He seems unwilling to believe whatever he saw. We have more intrigue, driven by an obvious question. What did Hendricks see? After the mission ends, the player character justifies their actions to Hendricks. Despite his unease earlier, Hendricks agrees that there was no other option. I think this demonstrates that, although Hendricks is a passionate man, and he can often lean towards righteous indignation, he's nonetheless reasonable. He can see why something needed to be done, even though he didn't like it. This demonstration of reason is a point of reference we can measure against later. When the mission starts, we learn what Hendricks saw. The security footage in fact showed Taylor and his team killing the people at the Black Station. Hendricks still doesn't believe it. The player character is starting to take Kane's side though. Despite their efforts, intel leaks are spreading and compromising Winslow Accord operations across the world. For some reason, Taylor sold out. The driving question in the narrative is, why did Taylor and his team do it? Well, Hendricks, Kane, and the player character want to find out too. They go off the best lead they have, following in the footsteps of his prior op, one that took place underneath the old Coalescence facility. Hendricks and the player infiltrate the facility. The mission starts off fairly standard, fighting through 54i goons that are guarding the place. When they get inside, they find signs of Taylor's team. When Kane asks about it, Hendricks lashes out.
But in all honesty, you have to know what a dumb question that is. Of course this was Taylor's work. CIA brought them here because these fucking goons were sniffing around.
Hey.
He doesn't want to believe Taylor and his team are behind this, but I think the intensity of this outburst shows that he's starting to doubt his own conviction. Amidst his uncertainty, he lashes out. As they go deeper into the facility, things become stranger.
Shit.
This level does a fantastic job at building tension. As the level progresses, it gets darker and darker. Likewise, we're traveling further and further down. And the deeper you go, well, the harder it is to get out. The darkness and the continued plunging combine to create a sense of claustrophobia, which increases the tension of the oddities we find, like the bizarre, seemingly self-piloting robots. The plot thickens when they come across a sign. Kane recognizes it as CIA. They have stumbled across a CIA Black project. They realize that Taylor's unit was likely sent in as the cleanup crew to cover up whatever was happening down here. We see Black Ops' trademark storytelling at work here. More revelations, but more questions. What were they trying to cover up? They go deeper. In a brilliant stroke, a new robot enemy type is introduced that charges at the player. With them, the dynamic of combat changes. Before, we were the predators assaulting this facility. Now we feel like prey, holding back an enemy that mercilessly hounds us. So the gameplay compounds the unease and tension created by the story's revelations. Kane comments on how the robots are acting strange. Without anyone to direct them, they shouldn't be attacking Hendricks or the player. They've gone rogue, but that shouldn't be possible. More questions are being added to this mystery. And they don't stop yet. Hendricks and the player come across a lab. Off-the-books experiments were conducted here. Before the catastrophic accident that brought Singapore to its knees, D&I trials weren't even supposed to be underway yet. The subjects are wired to a central server. They even find their original target, Zhejiang, and things aren't lining up.
Zhejiang. Wasn't he our mark? That doesn't make sense. That makes no sense. If he's dead, then why are we finding a bunch of slaughtered CIA matching his MO?
Give us a minute, Kane. CIA brings us in, assigns us an unknown contact, and then we just happen upon a CIA ops site? That makes sense to you?
Hendricks, what are you saying?
I don't know yet. Just keep your eyes and ears open, especially around Kane.
Questions upon questions. Nothing we've heard so far lines up anymore, and it makes us want to understand what really happened. Hendricks too demonstrates his continued distrust of Kane. The level gets even darker, approaching pitch black now. The main illumination comes from our enemies and the red haze emitted by flares. The feeling of unease and tension grows. Finally, as the player steps into an elevator, we start getting some answers.
Taylor was right. We've got to show the world the truth.
He's wired into the servers. His D&I is acting as a conduit for every piece of intel that's stored down here. He's been directing the robots, controlling their hive mind.
There are some things to glean from this conversation aside from the obvious. There is regret in Diaz's voice. He, along with the rest of Taylor's team, think they're doing the right thing. They haven't merely sold out to an enemy faction or nation. I think this revelation came at the perfect time. The player was just thrown for a loop after loop, almost being assailed by questions and oddities and unexplainable things. It ran the risk of being overwhelming. But now we're given a concrete direction. Diaz is controlling the robots. Diaz is uploading sensitive information to the world, potentially endangering even more lives. We have to stop him. Amidst all of the confusion, the player can at least latch onto this goal. The player fights through robots to stop Diaz. Despite the threat he presents, Hendricks still wants to take him alive.
We want him alive.
No guarantees, Hendricks.
His compassion for Diaz shines through once they finally take him down. Kane asks him to connect with Diaz's D&I, which Hendricks has a severe problem with.
This is someone I know. Someone I fought alongside. You shouldn't go out like this.
I'm sorry.
It's okay, Hendricks. I can see it. The frozen forest. Fuck!
The Frozen Forest. It's the first time we've directly heard about it, but we can glean that it's a source of comfort for Diaz. It almost sounds like an afterlife. Despite his hesitation, Hendricks interfaces with Diaz. What he sees shocks him, even more than last time. Once more, we're left wondering what he saw. There is a marked change in Hendricks. All his doubt about Taylor's team having turned is gone. So this segment gives us some answers, but it leaves us with about as many questions. But we have more immediate concerns. Go arrives, and she decides to flood the facility. We have to get out. After all of the new intrigue and mystery, the straightforward goal of escaping is refreshing. This mission has a great sense of pacing, balancing out big reveals and mystery with more straightforward story segments to give the player's mind a breather. It's one of the reasons that this mission is amongst the very best in the game from a storytelling point of view. The way this mission layers the mystery with revelations feels very reminiscent of the prior games, and the storytelling is complemented brilliantly by the level and art design as I've mentioned. Hendricks and the player manage to escape, but the situation remains dire. The world now knows that a CIA experiment was behind the disaster that killed hundreds of thousands of people in Singapore. Also, Diaz managed to leak the locations of all the CIA safe houses worldwide. This is extra bad because Kane happens to still be at a CIA safe house in the middle of Singapore. Go sends her 54 immortals after her. She wants revenge on Kane, Hendricks, and the player for what they've done to her. Kane urges Hendricks and the player to leave Singapore. Hendricks is on the same page. They need to stop Taylor now, otherwise things will get worse. He still doesn't trust Kane either. He thinks she's hiding more from them. The player character, on the other hand, is adamant that they need to rescue her. This is another demonstration of the player character's personality. They're loyal to those they serve with, and they won't leave a soldier behind, even one that may not be straight with them. There are no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The player character's moral certainty is a nice contrast against all the uncertainty and grayness around them. The next mission is very straightforward. The 54 immortals are closing in on Kane and we have to rescue her. After the mystery in the last mission, the straightforward goal is another great breather for the player. Black Ops 3's art design remains on point. The hazy reds communicate not only the danger that the city, now plunged in chaos, presents, but it also conveys the overarching ominous mood of the game's story. With the revelations provided by Diaz, we get the feeling that we're entering dangerous territory in the narrative. As the player and Hendricks make their way across the chaos-laden city, Taylor jacks into our comms, and he justifies his actions.
I told the truth. Behind a slick corporate front, the CIA conducted illegal human experiments. Experiments that would one day blow up in their face, leaving hundreds of thousands dead and even more left to suffer in the aftermath. Ask yourself, who's the bad guy in this situation? The people who survived a catastrophic event right on their doorstep? Or the fucking suits and yes men who covered it up? The Immortals built a society, however flawed, when the rest of the world looked away and left them to rot. Maybe they do want revenge. Maybe they just want justice. Either way, you can't deny that their anger is righteous.
Taylor!
While he speaks, the imagery presented to us counters his point. We see the suffering and destruction that his actions have caused. It's hard to believe this retaliation is truly justified, as we see gasoline being poured on innocents. Through this imagery, the game communicates that no matter how good or bad Taylor's motives, this is not the way to go about things. Hendricks and the player fight through more 54-eyed goons, eventually reaching Kane's location. She's in a burning building, and Hendricks thinks she's as good as dead. The player character disagrees, and he heads in alone to save her. The player finds Kane, but Go is here too, and she strikes from the shadows. She and the player struggle, with the player killing her in a gruesome burning sequence. She directed her goons to burn and torture civilians, so it feels like karma for her to meet a similar fate. Yet I think the graphicness is still meant to strike at the player. Your hands feel awfully bloody at this point. The player gets Kane out, and there's a moment of tension between them and Hendricks. There is a widening rift between the two. This tension continues to grow when they argue about their former friends.
You're okay with this?
Okay with what, Hendricks?
Okay with the fact that people like us, our former friends, decided to turn traitor. And now we've got to hunt them down.
They leaked classified intel that has allowed our enemies to know exactly where and when to strike. They implicated the CIA in the Singapore disaster. Their actions have destabilized the entire WA. So yes, you bet your ass, I'm okay with this.
Hendricks worked alongside Taylor's team longer than the player character, so it makes sense that he has a harder time being objective. Yet even with that in mind, he comes across as unreasonable here. It's clear that after everything Taylor's team has done, they cannot be allowed to continue. Hendricks should recognize that. The player character continues to see things from an objective point of view, and they continue to serve as a point of stability. The compromise of DNI protocols means it's no longer safe to maintain contact with the WA without further risk of damage. Hendricks and his allies are on their own. They know Taylor is hunting for survivors of the Black Project. One of those survivors is Dr. Salim in Cairo. Luckily, he's being held by ally forces in the Egyptian army. However, the region is on the precipice of falling due to Taylor's leaks. The enemy NRC are pushing the advantage, and the WA's allies are losing ground fast. One thing I wish is the game spent a bit more time fleshing out the factions. The NRC in-game are little more than a faceless, malignant entity. What's their ideology? What are they after and why? The same goes for the WA. We figure they're ostensibly the good guys since we're working under them, but at the same time they also feel pretty nebulous. Understanding a bit more about these factions, what motivates them, and perhaps most importantly how they contrast, would help place the player better in this world and its conflicts. I don't think there needed to be much, just a few more dialogue lines could have really gone a long way. When Hendricks and his allies arrive, they get a sit rep from Lieutenant Khalil about Cairo. In a nutshell, things aren't great. They have few men and they might not be able to hold on much longer. During this, we get Black Ops 3's biggest narrative link to its predecessor.
Can thank Raul Menendez.
What? Raul Menendez was a hypocritical egomaniac who thought he could make a better world by fucking everything up.
After the strikes of 25, all Winslow Accord nations had to abide by the Allied Drone Defense Act.
I've heard people call this a throwaway reference, essentially just a bone being thrown to the player base. However, I actually think it works pretty well in context. Menendez's movement focused on disenfranchised countries caught in the crossfire between great superpowers. Well, look at where we are now. Egypt is caught in a war between two reigning superpowers, the WA and the NRC. It's no surprise that Khalil is sympathetic to Menendez. Hendricks, on the other hand, has no sympathy. This also makes sense given that he's part of one of the superpowers, but even then his emotional outburst is a bit much. It's a pattern we're starting to see with Hendricks. He's been having trouble keeping his lid on. I also like how Menendez's attack explains why Cairo has a robust air defense system, which is currently the only thing bulwarking their defense. So overall, I think the reference here feels justified and grounds this world in its predecessors, at least in part. That isn't to say I don't wish there was more connective tissue between Black Ops 3 and the prior games. They reach the doctor and Hendricks interrogates him. He gets really fired up, and at first it seems like it's part of your typical good cop, bad cop act, but he continues after Kane orders him to stand down. It's that emotional unhingedness showing his face again. It's something that the player and Kane are beginning to notice too. They don't get much from the interrogation. They learn that the subjects weren't volunteers, but actually forced into the experiments. Before Hendricks can learn about the frozen forest, enemy NRC forces strike. Hendricks and his allies defend the station. Although they succeed at holding on, it comes at a cost. Taylor managed to take Dr. Salim. Lieutenant Khalil is pretty angry about how things turned out.
Instead, we lost Ramses, and soon the rest of Cairo!
Khalil, it's not too late. The people who did this are traitors. They're gonna continue to help the enemy. We need to fight back.
You don't even know where they are.
Kane, you got a fix on that tracker I slipped Salim?
Signal's holding steady. Target's on the move, 1 click south of Cabochette.
I like this scene because it reinforces the player character's personality. Even when they're getting yelled at, they keep their cool and balance out everyone around them. Hendricks in turn freaks out about the tracker. He thinks Kane and the player character are scheming against him, and he goes as far as physical violence. It's undeniable now. Something is happening to Hendricks, something causing him to lose his emotional control, ever since Singapore. When the player returns to base, there's a notable shift in character dynamics. Instead of speaking with Hendricks like we usually do, we speak with Kane instead. She opens up to us and reveals that the CIA were in fact planning on killing Taylor and his team to keep a lid on the Black Project. She's secretly running diagnostics on Hendricks, and she notices some irregularities in his DNI. She and the player character keep an eye on him. Hendricks' fear has in some part become a reality. We're keeping secrets from him now, but that's the fault of his own unreliability. They track Dr. Salim and they are stopped by Sarah Hall, one of Taylor's people. She pilots a mech and fights us, but she ultimately falls in battle. Kane urges the player character to interface with her DNI before she dies. Hall begs us not to, but we don't listen. Hendricks has a serious problem with this, and despite his irrationality, he has a point here. The player character doesn't even bother asking Hall for the information first. I recognize that Hall is dying, but nonetheless, the player character doesn't attempt to find any other recourse. They jump straight to an option that will be torturous to Hall. Hall warns the player character about interfacing with her. The player character thinks she's just talking about the general experience of interfacing, but as we'll learn later, they're dead wrong. We interface with her, and here's where things start to get strange. Instead of visiting Hall's past memories, the player finds themselves in darkness. Only frozen trees and surrounding bodies occupy the void. Is this the frozen forest Diaz mentioned? We overhear a voice, seemingly talking about human experiments at the Black Project, but they're drowned out by the cries of a baby. We find this child. As soon as we pick them up, the dream melts away and we're transported to the Black Project. Something happened.
This is where I was born.
This thing speaks. Something called Corvus, and this is where it was born. Something happens to the subjects and a gas unleashes. This is the toxin that killed 300,000 people and plunged Singapore into chaos. Sarah Hall, along with the rest of Taylor's team, come across the remains of the Black Project. Taylor pulls information from their central servers and he recoils from the experiments. Then he notes some glitches in his optics. From here, we're transported somewhere entirely unexpected. We join Sarah Hall in the battlegrounds of World War II. Yeah, you heard me right, World War II. The Siege of Bastogne to be precise. If I had to guess, this is where the game really lost a lot of players. There's just too much going on and it becomes really hard to follow. In the span of just a couple of minutes, we went from a black forest with confusing elements like babies crying, to time warping to the Black Project, to fighting in World War II. And these confusing elements continue. We even fight zombies during this level. In this dreamscape, a floating Sarah Hall is our tour guide, and she recounts what her team went through. But she's an unreliable storyteller. She tells us things that we know aren't true.
That wasn't what happened, Sarah. We saw the footage from the data drives. You did it. You butchered them in cold blood and made it look like a ritualistic killing.
So on top of the rapid scene changes and intense context switching, we have to parse through Sarah's retelling and determine what is true and what is false. And it's all just too much to process. It's really hard to not tune the story out because it's becoming so taxing to try to follow. This is bad. If you can't understand the basics of a story, then you feel disconnected from it. And as soon as you feel disconnected, you stop caring. There are a lot of cool ideas in this mission that make the player think. In fact, I would say pretty much all of the ideas and story beats are cool in isolation. But tsunami flooding the player with confusing or unexpected elements isn't the way. As a storyteller, you have to have some level of understanding of how much information players can absorb and even question at a time. I think this segment would have been greatly improved by stripping down elements and simplifying it. For instance, removing the frozen forest segment at the beginning and going right into Sarah Hall's recounting of the Black Project. Likewise, although the World War II setting is fun, I don't think it was necessary, and it's yet one more context switch that the player needs to wrap their mind around. I understand the reasoning for its inclusion. At the end of the mission, Sarah explains that the DNI, when short-circuited, unleashes a flood of memories that are half real and half imagined. Well, that's exactly what we just experienced, and it becomes important to explain the events of the game, which I'll get to later. Yet, I think this point could have still been made in a dream sequence that took place in the same setting as the rest of the game, or at least something less discombobulating than World War II. It's a small thing definitely, but with Black Ops 3 it's a death by 1,000 cuts. A handful of small adjustments to make the story more digestible would have really gone a long way. Okay, I've said my piece about this segment, so what do we learn from a storytelling perspective? Well, the part about the DNI creating dream worlds is perhaps the most important, but there are other important things. The biggest thing is that when Taylor interfaced with the Black Project server, he unleashed something. Something named Corvus, which was born from the Black Project, and this Corvus came to infect the rest of his team. They weren't fully in control of their actions. Hall thinks she's telling the player the truth. She doesn't realize that it was her team that killed the CIA operatives. The imagery in this section is really effective, by the way. Taylor's team looks like they're possessed by a ghost or maybe a demon when they commit the killings. It's truly bone-chilling. Our enemy here is greater than Taylor's team. Taylor asks Dr. Salim about the frozen forest. It turns out well that the frozen forest is nothing more than an idea. It was a comfort planted into the minds of the Black Project patients to help them find some measure of peace. This explains why the repeating phrases we've heard about the frozen forest sound almost like a lullaby.
Listen only to the sound of my voice. Let your mind relax. Imagine yourself in a frozen forest.
After the mission, the player character summarizes to Kane.
But Taylor's team, they won't get up. It's inside them. I think it's taking them somewhere.
Stay with me. Where is Taylor going?
He's still looking for the frozen forest.
They hunt down Taylor and his Romanian soldier Moretti to an aquifer in Egypt. They fight through enemy opposition, determined not to lose their quarry. The player character and Kane dive into a pool to get deeper into the facility. While swimming, something strange happens to the player. We hear Corvus uttering the same relaxing phrase that we've been hearing throughout the game. Then our system shut down. Darkness. Kane pulls us out of the water and she explains what just happened.
I checked your diagnostics. You're showing the same symptoms as Hendricks. Probably the same as Taylor's team.
Symptoms of what?
I think the AI software running the Black Project made the leap to organic. Your DNI was the gateway. It was born inside the test subjects, and now it lives inside all of you. Slowly taking control. Slowly driving you insane.
Not good for the player or Hendricks. However, this is good for the story. This injects some clarity into it. It explains Hendricks' irrational behavior. But past that, Hendricks and the player's predicament add stakes and urgency. Instead of just hunting Taylor to make sure he doesn't cause more damage, we have a real concrete consequence if we fail. The consciousness of the player and Hendricks will be consumed by this Corvus. Now, no matter how much confusion there may be in the story, we have something simple and concrete we can latch onto with the narrative. Catch Taylor, or the player and Hendricks will be victims. Another thing to note about this cutscene, there's an intimacy between the player character and Kane which feels out of place. The way she whispers Taylor almost makes it seem like she's speaking to you.
Taylor.
This doesn't make sense now, but it does based on the ending. The player and their allies continue the hunt, but during this, the player and Hendricks clash again. Hendricks is sympathizing more and more with Taylor. Based on what we've learned, it's likely Corvus's influence. Hendricks also brings up the player wanting to be with Kane, which once more feels out of place.
Oh, you're just getting a little bit sweet on her now, aren't you? Making plans for a nice house in the country and a perfect little family.
Even if it makes sense in light of the ending's interpretation, for a first-time playthrough it's confusing. You have no idea what Hendricks is talking about. Again, a death by 1,000 cuts. Taylor gets away, but the player ends up killing his last lackey Moretti. Hendricks, as you'd expect, is not too happy about this.
If you're so keen on us helping the CIA keep their damn secrets, then maybe I should put a fucking bullet in Kane's head right now!
You listen to me.
Honestly, the player character hitting Hendricks here is cathartic. His attitude in light of Corvus makes sense, but that doesn't mean it still isn't grating. I feel like the majority of the game is him becoming more and more irrational, which makes it harder to like him. I wish we would have had more time with Hendricks before he started to destabilize. It would have made it easier to still have sympathy with him here. The NRC starts a missile barrage, so we flee the aquifer. The hunt for Taylor continues. He's cut a deal with the NRC and is holed up in the Lotus Towers in Cairo. The city is itching for an uprising, so the player and their allies kick one off. It serves as a distraction to reach Taylor. We fight through the megacity with the resistance. This is one of the coolest settings in the game, and I like how it was set up. We heard about these megacities in the introduction and throughout the story, and now we see one firsthand. As with earlier in the game, this sort of setup and carry through helps bring the setting alive. During the mission, Hendricks and the player continue to destabilize. This is worsened by Taylor. His mind is overloading, and because the hosts of Corvus are connected, it's bleeding through to the other subjects. the player sees visions of black crows and frozen lands, which is very reminiscent of Sarah Hall's dream. Eventually they find Taylor. Hendricks pleads with him to stop, while the player keeps their guard up. Taylor is hollowed out, and Corvus has nearly taken over completely. Yet Taylor doesn't seem malevolent. He thinks he's leading others to safety. Despite what Dr. Salim said earlier, Taylor is convinced that the frozen forest is real. The player chases Taylor to the top of the Lotus Tower. They have a showdown, with Taylor piloting an attack ship. During the fight, the player pleads with him to stop, but to no avail. The player manages to take down the ship, but they get pinned. Taylor approaches, and he seems poised to make the killing blow. But then Taylor comes to his senses. By ripping out his DNI, Taylor is free of Corvus, but the infection is still in Hendricks and the player. Hendricks kills Taylor before he can speak further. The player character is aghast, but Hendricks throws the killing back in the player's face, saying it's what they wanted.
You won. You got what you wanted.
Hendricks!
Of course, this is very out of character for Hendricks. Throughout this story, he has been against killing Taylor's team and resisting the player every step of the way. This isn't Hendricks talking, it's Corvus. The infection wanted Taylor dead before he could influence the player or Hendricks to remove their DNIs as well. Hendricks leaves. With Corvus in control, he's our greatest threat, and we need to stop him. The player then blacks out. The player then finds themselves in a hospital bed, with Rachel Kane at their bedside.
If you go through with this, I can't be with you.
This is the only way.
It's going to change you. And quicker than you think.
I don't have a choice. I have to do this.
But your old life will fade away.
Their conversation is strange. It somewhat makes sense in the context of their situation, but it also doesn't. Yes, Corvus is going to change the player, and likely make them forget, but what is the player character's alternative but to chase Hendricks? Sit by Kane's side and rot away? It's another case of a scene that makes sense if you can piece together parts of the ending, but it doesn't make sense in the moment, and it leaves the player confused rather than buying further into the story. Hendricks attacks Zurich, the home and very heart of the Coalescence Corporation. His personal reasoning doesn't matter. He's the puppet of Corvus by this point. The player suspects that the AI wants to ensure its survival by spreading to other hosts, and there is no better place to start doing that than the Coalescence headquarters. They fight through an army of rogue defenses and get inside the building, where they come across a chemical research lab. This is another callback, this time to Black Ops 1. This is the very same weapon that Dragovich attempted to unleash across the US. Nova 6-2 was the agent responsible for the Singapore disaster. The player assesses the terminal and comes across bad news. The facility is going critical. Before Kane and the player go further, they have to stabilize the situation. The reset can only be done from inside, so Kane goes in. There she makes a disturbing discovery. Nova 6 is actually stable. Corvus tricked the player. The purge sequence initiates and Kane dies, with one final warning to the player.
Whatever this thing says, no matter what it does, you cannot trust it!
There's true sadness in the player character's voice, and it's heartbreaking. The reason it works is because of contrast. The player character has been very professional and level-headed throughout the story. Seeing this glimpse of true personal emotion stands out and conveys the true sorrow in the character's heart.
I'm sorry, Rachel. I'm so sorry.
The player continues on and reaches Hendricks. He has a hostage, Sebastian Kruger, the sole survivor of the Singapore disaster. Hendricks is angry because Kruger is continuing the same experiments that resulted in so much death and tragedy right here in Zurich. You can tell Hendricks is telling the truth based on the test pods littering the lab.
We want to know who we are and why we are here.
I can't answer that.
This is a strange question, but we'll see why it was asked soon enough. Hendricks shoots Kruger. The player then shoots Hendricks. The threat won't be over until the last carrier of Corvus dies, so the player turns the gun on themselves and pulls the trigger. Game over, right? Everyone's dead after all. Well, not quite. The player wakes up and finds themselves in a frozen forest. Hendricks greets us and he seems happy. This is a big contrast from the end of his life, where he was growing increasingly angry and paranoid. Meanwhile, the player character is the opposite. They lose their calm demeanor and are genuinely agitated.
It wants to help us.
How is this helping us?
Finally, we get an appearance of Corvus itself, and Hendrix explains where we are.
The frozen forest, it's real. And it's what comes next. Corvus has given us a way to live on after death.
You're not Hendrix. You're not real. None of this is!
Corvus isn't too jazzed that the player character isn't willing to go along with the flow. Hostiles arrive and we fight them. When they die, their bodies disintegrate into crows. We've seen them throughout the game whenever Corvus is involved. Crows are traditionally a symbol for death, so now that we're in the supposed afterlife, the symbolism is really fitting. The player reaches Corvus and Kruger, or at least a simulation of him. Corvus asks why he was created. Now Hendrix's earlier question makes sense. Then it was Corvus asking who it was and why it was created too. Kruger explains why the Black Project was started. The constant increase in technology's prevalence created more and more vulnerabilities. This is an astute observation that rings true today, especially with the major data breaches that seem to happen every other month. Well, you can't have a data breach if that data isn't there in the first place, right? So Kruger correctly identifies the problem. Where things get wonky is his solution. He thinks the best way to protect the populace is to closely monitor their thoughts and desires. Super surveillance to prevent attacks before they happen. And that hasn't exactly worked out great, has it? The player character continues after Corvus and Kruger, fighting Corvus's minions every step of the way. Hendrix isn't willing to fight alongside us, so he bails. I think this version of Hendrix is another manifestation created by Corvus with the purpose of stopping us. The real Hendrix, I believe, would help. Kruger's explanation doesn't satisfy Corvus, so the AI asks again.
You were a glitch, an anomaly, a mistake!
I am not a mistake!
Well, Corvus didn't like that very much now, did it? The AI doesn't really seem to have any motive besides existence itself. It just wants to know why it was placed here. Taylor appears offering us his aid. How he's here, well, it doesn't quite make sense because he tore out his DNI, and Taylor doesn't fully understand either. They chalk it up to a glitch. This inability to explain is intentional because it's followed up in the next scene.
Ready? Is that you?
Maybe it wasn't you that said it. You that did it. Maybe it was someone else. Their thoughts bleeding through into your brain.
What the fuck?
Taylor, are you still with me?
This scene doesn't make a ton of sense in the moment, and it's easy to write off as just another weird dreamlike sequence. In retrospect, it's pretty blatantly pointing out the ending of the game and what's really happening, but I'll dive more into that when I talk about the ending. The player and Taylor push on. During this, Taylor explains more of what Corvus really is.
It doesn't have some master plan. It just grows. It grows, snowballing into a wrecking ball of emotion that crashes through everything it touches.
I like this concept a lot. It subverts the traditional depiction of rogue AI in media, which is hyper-intelligent and reason-based. Corvus, on the other hand, is purely emotion-based, fueled by the memories of the Black Project victims, and it lacks a defined goal. Corvus is trying to find out what its goal really is. This goes to show once more that Black Ops 3 plays with a lot of really great ideas. I really love this segment of the level. The player fights in a battle of will against Corvus. The enemies you fight aren't real, but they're nonetheless a good metaphor for the battle of will that is taking place between the player character's mind and Corvus. Throughout this mission, you can see the toll this struggle is taking. At first, the player character is determined to stop Corvus, but as they progress, they grow less and less certain, looking to Taylor for help.
Taylor! Talk to me, please! I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know what to do!
This devolves until they're saying the frozen forest phrases to themselves.
Imagine somewhere calm.
Imagine somewhere safe. Imagine yourself in a frozen forest.
Their voice continues to grow more and more uncertain and sorrowful, and at the end they're almost crying.
Pure white snowflakes fall all around. You can feel them melt on your skin. It cannot overcome the warmth of your beating heart.
This part genuinely moved me. I think it works so well because of how the player character has been built up to this point. They've been established as someone who is always steady on their feet and unyielding under pressure. To see their stability being torn apart, piece by piece, communicates the magnitude of strain that their psyche is under. The player awakens to find themselves back in Zurich. Corvus is here too. Taylor somehow jumps into the fray to hold Corvus back. The player then activates a protocol to purge the DNI out of their system, and therefore purge the last remnants of Corvus. The player stumbles out of the building and comes across friendly forces. One of them asks their name. The answer is surprising.
What's your name?
Taylor.
And here the game ends abruptly. The player at this point is thrown for a loop, with questions about things that just don't make sense. The biggest is clearly, why on earth did the player just call themselves Taylor? What does that even mean? Also, how is the player still alive in Zurich? They shot themselves when they took down Hendrix. Or was that a dream too? If that could be a dream, how much else of the game could also be a dream? The ending of a game should leave the player with some type of emotion, but the abject confusion that Black Ops 3's ending gives the player is not good. The ending doesn't feel satisfying, but far from it. The story doesn't make sense. At this point, I suspect most players' reactions will be to A. Consult Reddit, B. Uninstall the game, or C. Just hop into multiplayer or zombies. I've gone through the story as it appears to the player when they first play. In other words, it's the surface level events, but on their own, they don't come together in a coherent way. So let's dive into what really happened. I'll cut right to the chase. Most of the events in this game didn't actually happen, or at least not like we just experienced them. The first mission really happened, where the player character got torn apart by robots. For the rest of the game though, they're still in surgery getting their DNI installed. During this, we're connected with Taylor. Because of this link, we share most of his memories and they mix in with ours. The missions you play through were actually events Taylor himself experienced. Some of the players in the events were shuffled around. We occupy Taylor's role. The Rogue Squad wasn't actually Taylor's team, but instead a team led by a man named Dylan Stone. The player's surgery goes south. There are complications. As Sarah Hall said, a short-circuiting DNI can create a flood of memories and emotions, resulting in a world half real and half imagined. We experience Taylor's world, half real and half imagined. With this in mind, a lot of the events in the story make more sense. For instance, that mirror scene in the final mission. Our character turns into Taylor, while Moretti says that others' thoughts are bleeding into our brain. It's pointing to this reality. Likewise, our relationship with Kane makes more sense. Taylor in the first mission discusses his relationship with Rachel. Well, this is the very same Rachel Kane we encounter. His thoughts are bleeding into ours. Thus, their romantic relationship starts to bleed into our imagination. It may seem to come out of nowhere during the story, but it's intentionally this way. This explanation of events is more than merely an interpretation. It's explicitly confirmed by the game. Where, you might ask? We just played through the game, and besides these hints and nods, there isn't anything so blatant to absolutely confirm this theory. Well, it's in the mission briefings. You know, the text that scrolls too fast for anyone to properly read unless you're screenshotting it. Yeah, I'll talk more about that later. But suffice it to say, if you record the gameplay and pause, it's all there laid out fairly plainly if you manage to find it. I'm going to refer to these loading screen texts as Taylor's notes because that's what they are. Did I find the significance of these notes on my own? No. Like most people, Reddit and the Call of Duty wiki helped me out. If I'm making a giant story analysis and I struggle to find out the basics of the story, well, that says a lot, doesn't it? Well, past this information, I think there's a lot of room for interpretation. After all, the player is in a half real and half imagined world. Exactly which parts are real and which parts are interpretations are up for some debate. In Taylor's notes, he confirms that the player dies from complications from the surgery. A popular theory is that the player's hallucinogenic dream is simply their death throes, just like Sarah Hall. There is no further impact of the story aside from their visions before their death. I personally don't like this interpretation. It takes the wind out of the story's sails for me. It makes everything in the game feel pointless. If all of these visions have no consequence, then why are we experiencing them? Here's my interpretation. I like it because it adds more weight to this journey, even if most of it is imagined. I'm sure there are some holes in it, but then again, I feel like there are holes with a lot of theories around the story. I'll include some of the resources I use in the video description, so you can look for yourselves and make up your own mind. As far as I can tell, John Taylor's notes never mention Corvus. That might lead you to believe that the AI isn't real either, but it's just a manifestation of the player's hallucination. However, I still think Corvus was a real entity. I think Taylor came into contact with Corvus at the Black Site, in the same way that we saw in the game. We've seen that Corvus can lay dormant in people's minds, taking control or relinquishing it. I think Corvus infested Taylor's brain, and reduced his consciousness to a shell. Yet, Corvus continued to act as Taylor. If you're an AI and you don't know what your purpose is, it would make sense that you just emulate the actions of the person you inhabited. Might as well just fake it until you make it, right? It's also why the journals wouldn't mention Corvus. If the AI had infected Taylor, why would it mention itself? For its own survival, it would keep quiet. When the player is injured and Taylor interfaces with his DNI, Corvus and Taylor bleed into the player's head. Corvus wants to spread to the player too, but the remnants of Taylor want to destroy Corvus because of the danger it presents. So Taylor shows his memories to the player and walks through them to establish Corvus and impress the threat the AI presents. Corvus, meanwhile, is fighting for its own influence. This culminates in the last mission, where you battle Corvus's influence. Taylor gains back some level of control and holds off the AI. I think Taylor's grand plan is to pull Corvus into the player's consciousness along with Taylor's own. That way everything is contained in the player's mind, so to speak. When the DNI purge is kicked off in the simulation, it's the player's body dying, as John's report indicates. We kill Corvus by containing the AI and killing the body it inhabits, but Taylor doesn't make it out. He holds the AI in the player's body, and he's too much of a remnant to survive anyway. I think the player and Taylor actually do a body switch, with the player surviving in Taylor's body. It's why Taylor says you're in control now, and the player ends the game with I am Taylor.
Let peace be upon you. You are in control.
What's your name?
Taylor.
The player is now in Taylor's body, but so much of their consciousness is fused, it's hard to make the distinction. I like this interpretation because it feels like the story still matters. Even if most of it is a simulation, it's still all in service of eliminating this threat which could potentially cause damage to the world. It feels like everything still has a purpose. But again, that's just my interpretation. I'm curious to hear from you. So, well, that's a quote-unquote real story, and I think it's really interesting. A lot of the interpretations are really fascinating, and there's a lot to delve into. However, I nonetheless think the way that the narrative was structured was a mistake. It's just too inaccessible. If you're having to freeze frame mission introductions to get a basic idea of the story, something's gone wrong. There has to be a narrative through line for the player to hold on to. There can be multiple interpretations or even hidden explanations for a story, but Black Ops 3's story isn't intelligible unless you dive into this niche theory crafting. It's great for YouTube videos, but it leaves the player cold. Black Ops 3 has a unique story to tell, and it uses some innovative story techniques, like having a journal told through the loading screens. But I think what Black Ops 3 teaches is that being interesting isn't enough. A story can be interesting, but it can still fail to be captivating. It can be interesting but fail to be engaging. It can fail to make the player resonate with it or care. Black Ops 3 has a lot going for it. The setting is fascinating. The DNI systems and the rules around them are intriguing and naturally facilitate moral dilemmas and conflicts within the narrative. Corvus is a subversive idea for the AI. The art design is beautiful and perfectly tuned for the dark yet technologically advanced future the game presents. And finally, the gameplay is a true highlight in the series. But all of these elements fade into the background because they're overwhelmed by a pervading sense of confusion that the narrative leaves. Black Ops 3 may have a ton of incredible ideas, but the execution of those is critical. If players don't care about your story, then the details don't really matter. And the most important part of getting players to care about a story is to make sure they understand what's going on. If they can't understand the basics well, then they don't really have anything to care about in the first place. Black Ops 3 had the potential to be the best campaign. I truly believe that. But Black Ops 3 is a showcase that ideas on their own won't save a story. Execution of those ideas is even more important. Now onto Black Ops 4. You may have noticed that this section is considerably shorter than the others. That's because Black Ops 4 doesn't have a campaign. Instead, its primary game modes are multiplayer, zombies, and the Blackout Battle Royale mode. And well, because this is a campaign retrospective, that means we don't have a lot to talk about here. Does Black Ops 4 still have a story? Well, kind of. There's a specialist HQ that essentially serves as a tutorial on how to play each of the game's characters, like Rune and Firebreak. For each character, there's a brief tutorial followed by a multiplayer bot match. Between these specialist missions, there's an overarching story told via cutscenes that centers around the warring granddaughters of Alex Mason. They're fighting over Savannah's project to bring the dead back to life. Which, yeah, you can already tell by that premise that the story will be strange. The story is just not told in an engaging way. After each tutorial mission, there's a small cutscene, some of which are maybe 5 seconds long. It doesn't do anything to pull you in or intrigue you. And the end of the story isn't really an end either. All the specialists switch from Savannah to Jessica's side and declare war against the former sister. And it just ends there. There's no resolution. The story really seems like just an excuse to introduce the player to all the specialists and their abilities. How you tell a story is just as important as the story itself, and the way the story is told doesn't hold a candle to any of the other games. The best analogy I can think of is the difference between watching a movie for yourself versus someone telling you the plot of a movie. Even though you may end up walking away with the same understanding of the story, you're missing out on actually experiencing the thing yourself. Black Ops 4 feels like someone telling me the plot of a story rather than telling me a story, if that makes sense. It's clear that the Specialist HQ isn't meant to be a real campaign narrative experience. This is a product of compromise, not someone's artistic vision. As proof of this, Black Ops 4 did in fact have a campaign, but it was scrapped, and the Specialist HQ is the remnants. I can't imagine that this is the style of narrative that anyone is truly after. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's no campaign, and it's certainly no replacement for one. The legacy of Black Ops 4, at least from a campaign perspective, is that it put the series' identity into even more question. The campaigns of Black Ops to me were once the beating heart of the series, but clearly Black Ops 4 survived and even thrived without one. I remembered wondering when this game came out if it marked the end of campaigns in Call of Duty entirely. Thankfully, that ended up not being the case. At the time of Cold War's release, the Black Ops series was in a bit of an identity crisis, at least when it came to the campaigns. Black Ops 1 is a tightly paced thriller. Meanwhile, Black Ops 2 tells an entirely different sort of story, utilizing branching narratives and spinning a truly dynamic tale. Although the story frameworks are different, the one consistent through line is that they're both well-told stories. Black Ops, up to this point, was known as a series that tells a good story. Then Black Ops 3 arrived. The game delves deeply into the very nature of reality, and it got a bit too lost in the sauce while doing so. Although I think it has a lot of redeemable qualities, it no doubt didn't land with most players. Was it a good story? In some ways maybe, but a well-told story? Certainly not. So what's the through line between these games? The Black Ops series has always experimented with its campaigns, but as a result, there aren't many similarities between them. What makes a Black Ops campaign exactly? This situation got worse with Black Ops 4 because it didn't even have a campaign. The question arose, is a campaign even important to a Black Ops game anymore? When Cold War was initially announced, along with the return of a campaign, I was skeptical. I didn't know where the series was going. When you add in all of the reports of Cold War's harried development, especially in the midst of the pandemic, I was certain that the game would fall flat on its face. But despite my low expectations, when I booted up the campaign, I found an experience worthy of the Black Ops name. It's one of the most pleasant surprises I've had in years. Cold War feels like a greatest hits album of Black Ops. Elements from each game were carefully curated and included here. It works really well, but it's more than just a good time. In light of Black Ops' identity crisis, Cold War arrived at just the right moment. It's a game that unifies its predecessors, and it brings the identity of the series into clearer light. Because Cold War combines elements across the series to form a singular experience, I feel like it's easier to answer the question, what is a Black Ops campaign? Cold War is far from a perfect game, but it arrived at the perfect time. For a series and identity crisis, this was exactly what it needed. So we're going to walk through Cold War's campaign. We're going to look at what Cold War carries through from prior games and see how they work into Cold War's vision. We're also going to look at Cold War's unique contributions, both good and bad. At the end, we'll finally answer the question, what makes a Black Ops campaign a Black Ops campaign? Cold War opens with a speech by Ronald Reagan as world events flash across the screen. The space race, the Red Scare, the Iranian hostage crisis. The main purpose of this introduction is to establish the game's time and place, which it does so excellently. We're in the 80s, in the midst of the Cold War. After this intro, the player takes the shoes of Alex Mason, the protagonist of Black Ops 1 and a secondary protagonist in the sequel. Returning players feel right at home. But the man we're with is a new face, Russell Adler. Right away, Cold War is mixing the old with the new. Mason and Adler meet with a contact, and they're cleared to move on to their target, Qasim Asim. He's one of the 2 terrorists they're after, both of whom are connected to the Iranian hostage crisis. The bar is smoky. It's the 80s, the days of being able to smoke indoors. There's a haze drifting through the place, which the bar's tacky neon lights illuminate. Music blasts from the jukebox, overly loud as it tends to be in bars. Decorations hang over the bar. New Year's 1981. This bar just oozes atmosphere, and you feel a keen sense of place. One of Cold War's best merits is its ability to create atmosphere in its levels, and it has some of the most memorable in the series. This bar is just a taste. Mason and Adler meet with series mainstay and fan favorite Frank Woods. Together they creep through alleyways en route to their target. It's not long before the gunfire starts. It feels like the good old days, playing as Mason with Woods at our side. Eventually we capture our target and Mason interrogates him. Here we're introduced to one of Cold War's new gameplay systems, dialogue choices. It signifies a return to some of the narrative choice that Black Ops 2 did so well. So, what are our options here? Well, you can either throw Asim off the balcony or interrogate him further. If you do the former, you miss out on intel that is crucial to solving one of the side missions. After the interrogation concludes, assuming you didn't throw him off, you can then decide again whether to toss him or alternately capture or release him. None of these choices really have any impact on the narrative. The only choice of any real consequence is the side mission intel. But funnily enough, that still makes this decision one of the more story-impacting ones in the game. But we'll talk more about decisions and consequences later, because I think Black Ops Cold War uses them in an interesting way. One way or another, Asim is taken out of the picture. Mason's team heads after their next target, Arash. They get to a Turkish airfield and identify their suspect. Arash then does something unexpected.
Just diced everyone in a truck. That's gotta be Arash.
Arash decides to kill everyone in the vehicle he just arrived in. It's very strange, but it will make more sense later. Mason then takes a shot at the terrorists, but he botches the shot. What follows is a thrilling chase after Arash's plane in a desperate bid to stop him before he makes off. Although this sequence is exciting to play, it's also very clever. The high intensity orients the player's brain toward action. Aim, shoot, acquire the next target, and continue. The action pulls the player away from thinking about Arash's odd execution. The player isn't really given enough time to process what just happened, and many will just outright forget the Arash execution. I know I did my first playthrough. It's the very same technique that Black Ops 1 uses when Mason is in a rat hole in Vietnam. Swift's suspicion of Mason's sanity could have given away the entire story if the player was given enough time to think about it. But the game abruptly follows this part up with an enemy ambush, so the player isn't able to process it. So just like its predecessors, Cold War is great at planting narrative seeds that either go unnoticed, are misinterpreted, or are otherwise obfuscated and then forgotten. The good guys manage to capture Arash. In his last minutes, he laughs at the Americans, telling them that it was never really about the hostages.
Hostages? It was never about the hostages. His plan is already underway. You won't be able to stop him this time.
Instead, this is all part of a grand plan orchestrated by a man named Perseus. a Russian spy long thought dead, a clear and present danger. Adler kills Arash. He tells Mason to hunt the tarmac for survivors. This is another small narrative seed being planted. Adler and Mason's team debriefs the White House. Here we see another familiar face, James Hudson, Mason and Wood's CIA handler from Black Ops 1 and 2. He explains Perseus's past and how they know of him.
1943. Detailed information from the Manhattan Project was stolen from Los Alamos by the Russian spy known as Perseus. 1968. Vietnam War. Viet Cong soldiers, orchestrated by Perseus, attempted to steal an American-made nuclear bomb from a U.S. firebase. 5 days ago, while on a mission, we acquired intel that Perseus is in play again and planning an attack on the West.
And while he's just like the Hudson from before, taciturn and all about the mission, Cold War manages to recapture the essence of the returning characters in this game, which is something I greatly appreciate. It's no small feat, especially given the great span of time since we last saw them in Black Ops 2. Hudson asks for authorization to go after Perseus. Other officials in the room are skeptical of their requests because they're illegal. Here, the story is establishing the CIA's moral ambiguity, a long-running theme for the series. President Reagan isn't too concerned about the details. Perseus is a threat, so he'll give Hudson and Adler whatever they want.
Gentlemen, you've been given an important task, protecting our very way of life from a great evil. There is no higher duty, there is no higher honor. And while few people will know of your struggles, rest assured, the entire free world will benefit. I know you won't fail us.
I highlight this part of Reagan's speech for contrast later. It is a bit eerie to see a real historical figure rendered in such crisp detail. The game's faces, especially in cutscenes, are really impressive, even years later. Say what you will about the importance of graphics in games, but I think they enhance the harsh realism that Black Ops is going for. Hudson speaks with his overseer, Emerson Black, about the team Adler is putting together. They have suspicions about his choices, which honestly feels on brand for the CIA. They have the greatest apprehensions about an agent named Bell.
And the new one.
Bell? Well, don't get me started. That's the one we need to keep our eyes on.
So who is this mysterious Agent Bell? Well, that's you, the player. Cold War brings back character customization from Black Ops 3. It's more limiting appearance-wise, with you only able to change the skin tone of your arms, which makes sense considering the entire campaign takes place in first person. You can give your character a name, but it doesn't really matter because they'll only ever go by Bell anyway. I named my Bell Mark Northfield after the protagonist in my book series, which, yes, is a shameless plug. You can give them a background, which also doesn't have too much of an effect. There are a few small lines of dialogue that can change from what I can tell, but the most interesting feature is the psychological profile. These are essentially perks for your character, and they actually have a pretty big effect. For instance, aggressive behavior increases your reload speed by 50%. Fearless, on the other hand, decreases explosive damage by 50%. Although these perks are mainly just number tweaks to existing stats, they're big enough tweaks to have a noticeable effect on gameplay. So when you change up your perks, subsequent playthroughs can actually feel pretty different. Since Cold War is a game that many players will want to go through twice to experience both of the main endings, this is a welcome addition. It also allows you to express Bell as a character through gameplay. Will Bell be a calm, accurate, nimble shooter? Or instead someone who hunkers down with a belt full of grenades to lob? While we're on the topic, let's talk about gameplay. How does it differ from its predecessors? Cold War returns to the more grounded gameplay of Black Ops 1 and 2, which makes sense given the setting. There are some niceties brought through from the prior year's game, Modern Warfare. For instance, being able to reload while still aiming down sights. This makes the gameplay feel more fluid than its predecessors. The most flashy new gameplay feature is the ability to use enemies as body shields. You can grab onto enemies and then either shoot at other opponents, kill your hostage, or push them forward with a grenade, turning them into a bona fide explosive. Doing this isn't always the most practical option, especially in hairy gunfights. However, when a plan works out like you expect, and you're gunning down enemies with your hostage, which you turned into a well-timed explosive as a grand end to your antics, you feel like a genuine 80s action hero. The melee animations too are beefed up to give off a cinematic feel, although the animations can be a bit too long for my tastes and thus feel slightly clunky. I can't deny that they add a layer of spectacle to the experience. So I think gameplay is another great example of how Cold War synthesizes elements from its predecessors. Cold War takes the gameplay customization of Black Ops 3 and it pairs this back to work with a gameplay format more similar to its predecessors, one that also makes sense given the game's time period. In summary, the mechanics are aiming towards giving off the vibes of an 80s action movie, and I think the game really succeeds at it. Okay, that's my take on gameplay. Back to the narrative. When the player takes Belle's shoes, the very first scene opens with an odd yellow filter which quickly disappears. This is something most players won't notice, and I certainly didn't until going over my gameplay footage for this video. But right from the get-go, this is foreshadowing the game's big reveal.
Belle, welcome to West Berlin. We've got a job to do.
Adler will say this phrase often throughout the game. This too is more foreshadowing, but first-time players won't think much of it. Cold War is subtly and consistently laying down the groundwork for its story. It really takes a page out of Black Ops 1's book in this regard. Belle and Adler enter a CIA safe house, and here they meet the other members of their team, Park, Lazar, and Sims. There isn't much in the way of introducing or building their characters here. They're all about the mission right away. It makes sense given their occupation, but I also think it's a missed opportunity. The game could have cleverly worked in more character building here. With how little we see of these characters throughout the story, the game really needed to use every moment at its disposal to get the most out of its characters. The team has no leads, so they start by looking into the past. They review a past mission in Vietnam, which was a contact point between them and Perseus. The player starts the mission via the evidence board. This is a nice narrative device. The evidence attached to each event feels like a natural way to integrate background story elements that correlate to the mission. Here we learn that Sims served under Adler in Vietnam, and that is where they grew as teammates. When the mission starts, Adler and Sims reviewed the mission. Things went sideways. This detail is good at building narrative anticipation. Now we as the audience want to know how the op went bad. The mission starts, and we board a helicopter with Sims and Adler. There to recover a classified asset that the Viet Cong are close to capturing. But soon Adler announces a detour. Our now infamous Russian operator named Perseus has been spotted in the area. A tense fight against the Viet Cong follows. Sims and Belle come across a big red door, which looks out of place in the village. When Belle sees it, there's a flash of yellow, much like Belle's introduction. I didn't even notice these two narrative breadcrumbs until reviewing the footage for this video. It speaks again to just how well Cold War plants these seeds. They seem so obvious now that I've noticed them, but they certainly weren't before. Inside, Sims and Belle come across Soviet soldiers. Their presence here is unexpected, and the intrigue builds. They recover the intel in the safe house. Then, they extract and head to their original target, the classified asset that the Viet Cong are after. They fend off the enemy via helicopter, and then they land at the US base to secure the asset. It turns out that this asset is actually a nuke.
A fucking nuke? Are you fucking kidding me, Adler? It's a failsafe, that's all you need to know. We that desperate already. Not yet.
Nukes is a failsafe. We'll see this tactic used later again in the story. Perseus somehow knew about the nuke. It's established that Perseus is a man with deep connections. Their chopper goes down, which is a little bit of a road bump. Adler and his men fend off attacking Viet Cong, securing the nuke and the intel on Perseus. When the mission, along with the memory, concludes, we hear that phrase from Adler again.
Told you we had a job to do. It ain't done yet, not by a long way.
Afterwards, Hudson discusses their progress with Black.
Yeah.
How did the memory exercise go?
Well, to hear it from Adler, it's working. Belle remembered finding that encrypted intel in Vietnam and is almost finished decoding it.
This conversation is a bit strange when you really contemplate what Hudson is saying. Based on how the mission is set up, the natural assumption is that in current time, Adler's team is still in the safe house. cluttered around the central table or evidence board, and they're talking about their time in Vietnam. The flashback mission is just a gamified version of their conversation, where the player gets to live through what they're talking about firsthand. That's a pretty common storytelling convention for games, and Black Ops capitalizes on that assumption. However, instead of describing Adler's progress as a conversation or recounting, Hudson describes it as a memory exercise. It's odd phrasing, but I suppose you could handwave it. What's especially odd is that he says it's working, and that Bell managed to remember finding the encrypted intel. Why would you need an exercise for this? You would imagine it would be easy to just ask Bell, "Hey, do you remember nabbing that classified intel in Nam that one time?" And you wouldn't need an exercise around it. And you wouldn't describe someone's recollection as working. I won't belabor this. Point being, the way Hudson speaks about Bell has always been a bit odd. But as always, most of these little oddities aren't things you'll pick up on the first go around, or just write them off. Bell decodes this intel, and they finally have some leads to go off of. But there's something else going on.
Does the team know about our mishap in Berlin yet?
No, but if it's connected to one of those names from Bell, they'll find out soon enough.
You won't let that happen, Hudson. Don't say anything more than necessary.
This mishap in Berlin piques the player's interest. Like Black Ops 1, Cold War does a great job of continually setting up new narrative threads that get the player asking questions. Park manages to secure a connection to Perseus via a man named Anton Volkov in Berlin. The team is to set out and kill or capture him. Before departing, the player has a chance to wander around the safe house and talk to their allies. This is available before most missions, until the very last ones, and it serves as a way to speak to your teammates in a more relaxed manner. I think this is a great idea, because it provides an opportunity to get to know the characters better. The execution, however, is a mixed bag. One thing that these hub missions do is create an air of secrecy. Adler and the others have secret conversations excluding you. Adler will leave to take a phone call from his office, or he'll ask Park to speak in private. Sometimes the reason sounds innocuous enough. For instance, he leaves to speak with Collections one time, but how do we know this is really what his conversation is about? This is the CIA here. That could be a cover for all we know. This secrecy creates the impression that there is a lot more going on than you know, and it also creates a feeling of exclusion. You're not trusted enough to be in these conversations. It's a subtle touch, but the subtlety is what makes it work so well. So I think these hub missions are great for that. Unfortunately though, I don't think they succeed at their primary goal, and that is an opportunity to get to know and bond with your allies. The conversations are just frankly not very engaging. It's stuff like, how do you know Adler? Have you worked with him before? What do you know about Volkov? And the characters don't really do much with these questions. You don't feel like you really know them better, or have any connection. You can have a conversation with Sims about requesting increasingly extravagant weapons, but even this conversation lacks a sense of energy or vitality.
Clever. But I wasn't joking earlier.
Look, I get these are hardened covert agents, and secrecy is their whole thing, but you've still got to do a little bit more here with the characters. None of it's bad, but I think it's the game's biggest missed opportunity. Later events in the story would have hit a lot harder if some of the groundwork was laid here. Volkov has a drop with one of his associates, so it's the perfect time for Adler's team to strike. They need to infiltrate from West Berlin to East Berlin, and they do so via sneaking through subway tunnels. The beginning of this level is just great. You and Adler start on this grimy, dingy train, then sneak through graffiti-laden subway tunnels while passing trains rattle the earth. They ascend to the rain-soaked rooftops where the haze of neon lights pierces the darkness. Searchlights and barbed wire abound right next to civilians cowering from the dismal weather. As I talked about with the game's opening scene in the bar, one of Cold War's great strengths is its ability to create a vivid atmosphere for each of its levels, one that draws you into its setting like a moth to the flame. Bell meets with one of their contacts in a bar, and they eavesdrop on a nearby table with Volkov's associates. They learn of an informant that Volkov's men have captured. Your contact Greta asks you to take care of the problem by either saving or silencing the informant. This is an optional mission objective, a returning feature from Black Ops 2, It makes the game world feel a bit more dynamic, like there's more going on than just the mission, you know? So we sneak out. There are a couple new game mechanics introduced here. One is a lockpicking minigame. It's simple, but I appreciate that in a game like this. I didn't buy a lockpicking game after all. And this mechanic is used to great effect in a later mission. The second gameplay mechanic is stealth. Stealth has been in prior games, but it's more fleshed out here. It's a bit more open-ended. Enemies have patrols and detection meters. The mechanic fits this level's setting well. It's also a welcome mechanic because it changes up the pacing, yet it's not overused. The use of stealth in the game feels calculated, not haphazard. If you head after the informant, you'll find him held prisoner by guards. However, if you read the intel on the desk, you'll see that the situation is a bit more hairy than you initially thought. The guards note that the prisoner is actually a double agent for the KGB, but then the informant retracted this confession. Now you have to figure out what to do with this guy, kill or spare him. You can interrogate him further. If you ask him about the intel, he says not to trust the guards. So, the situation remains ambiguous. This is a rat's nest of moral questions. Is he a traitor or not? Even if he is, should you kill him or bring him in instead? Your decision here doesn't really have an impact on the game's story, but it gets your brain primed to think about moral situations and what the right thing to do is. Plus, it helps you define Belle's character. What sort of person is Belle? But I'll get more into the game's choices later. Belle rendezvous with Lazar and Park. They find their Mark Krause, and Belle sneaks into the apartment. What follows is one of the game's most interesting stealth segments. You're equipped with a tranq gun, and you have to sneak around Krause's family to find the intel you're looking for. You can put his wife to sleep, but if you do, you have to stage the scene so he doesn't become suspicious. This is a good example of Cold War's willingness to innovate with its missions, and I don't think it gets quite enough credit for it. Belle finds Krause's secret room and plants a tracking beacon. Unfortunately, Krause sneaks in and gets the better of our agent. Belle wakes up, tied to a chair next to Greta. Volkov speaks to us and we're able to respond via dialogue choices. These don't have any effect on the mission either, but they provide a way for the player to express Belle's personality. Is Belle standoffish or professional? You get to decide. Adler and his team arrive in the nick of time, bailing Belle out. After a tense fight in the warehouse, you reach Volkov, and Belle gets to decide whether to kill or capture him. At the risk of repeating myself, this choice also doesn't have much of an impact. It's really about the player defining Belle's moral compass. With the intel they gather from Volkov, they confirm that Percy has managed to smuggle a nuclear device through East Berlin.
We can't be certain of that yet.
He has it. I'm sure of it.
Well, at least Hudson is sure of it. Adler isn't. What makes Hudson so certain? What intel is he working off of? It's another oddity. Further intel leads to the discovery of a secret Soviet base in Ukraine. Adler deploys Belle along with Frank Woods to infiltrate the base and see what's going on there. This is my favorite mission in the game. When Woods and Belle break through the forest line, they're greeted by a massive complex. The sheer size of it is a spectacle in of itself, and the way it looms is ominous but also captivating. As I've been talking about, Cold War is fantastic at crafting the settings of each of its levels, and this one gets even more memorable. The mission is enhanced by having Woods at your side. He's just as distinctive of a character as ever, with his biting snark and gruffness. It really highlights the contrast between the new and returning characters. Woods just has the it factor, the pop I guess, that the new crew doesn't. It almost feels like the writers feel more comfortable writing Woods than the others. The notable exception to this criticism is Adler, but I want to wait to talk more about him later. Woods and Belle infiltrate the facility, and they stumble across something entirely unexpected. They find themselves in an arcade of all places. There are even vintage Activision games that you can boot up and play here, adding to the level's character. In fact, it's not just an arcade. This place is a one-to-one replica of a small-town US Main Street, replete with a movie theater, bars, and the other trappings you'd expect. Soviets are running through training exercises here, preparing for the possibility of a war with the US. This is such a fantastic concept for a mission. It's both creative, memorable, and pertinent to the Cold War setting, and it also makes for a great combat arena when things inevitably go south. They reach a computer terminal and discover something called Operation Greenlight. Within the project, they discover something else unexpected, audio from none other than Hudson and Black.
We confirmed it. The nuke smuggled out of Berlin is a green light asset. It's one of ours.
If that gets out...
No one will know, not even Adler's team. The stakes are too high.
High is an understatement. We're talking about an American nuke hidden beneath Berlin.
This brings clarity to a few of the oddities throughout the story. This is the mishap Hudson was speaking about earlier. Similarly, this also explains how Hudson knew for certain that Perseus had a nuke. Well, it's because it was the US's. Woods is characteristically angry about this, but his rage will have to wait. He and Bell have to get out of Dodge. An intense escape follows, but our heroes make it out without too many scratches. Then they finally confront Hudson. Tensions are a bit high, as you can imagine. Even Hudson, who's generally the poster boy of calmness, gets tense.
You might want to rethink that, Woods.
Adler is the only one who remains entirely calm. I think this is a good point of contrast for Adler's character. If he's so calm that he makes even Hudson look emotional, then man, he's one stone-cold killer.
That's what you do best, isn't it, Hudson? Manipulate people. Tell them your own version of the truth.
There is no truth. Only who you choose to believe. Adler knows all about that. Don't you, Russ?
This is another breadcrumb for later. Hudson is calling Adler out for manipulating people and making them believe a version of the truth. One thing I especially appreciate about this confrontation is that it provides additional context for Black Ops 2. Woods has a deep suspicion and animosity towards Hudson throughout the whole game, and it seems to date before Hudson's betrayal at the past plotline's climax. Woods says he should have known about Hudson's treachery. As far as I can recall, Hudson and Woods don't have a ton of interaction that we saw in Black Ops 1 to justify this to the audience. With the events in Cold War, well, it makes total sense. After they finish their insults and accusations, Hudson fills them in on what Operation Greenlight is.
Back in '58, the arms race was in full swing. Eisenhower was convinced if the Reds moved on Europe, we couldn't respond quick enough. So he authorized Operation Greenlight, a top-secret program that placed nuclear bombs in every major European city. The ultimate countermeasure to a Soviet invasion. 74 of the bombs were upgraded to high-yield neutron bombs, capable of terminating personnel without damaging infrastructure.
Thousands dying in a flash. You're talking about fucking infrastructure.
How's that for civilized? We kill the people but preserve the buildings.
We're trying to preserve our way of life.
It's just like Nam, where they also almost lost a nuke. Except, well, this time Perseus actually got a hold of the nuke. Maybe they'll learn their lesson sooner or later, huh? Woods and Mason are disgusted, but Hudson is adamant that this was necessary as a deterrent. The story stakes are clear now. Stop Perseus from detonating the nuke, or the following destruction will be placed on the US's shoulders. Hudson somehow still makes this Adler's fault.
We wouldn't have this problem if you'd done your job. Killed Perseus in Vietnam.
Careful, Hudson. Next time, I might not stop Woods.
Adler remains dead calm, yet he still manages to convey a threat with more weight to it than anything any of the men around him have just said. Again, he's a stone-cold killer on an entirely different level. They move out on a lead to get Perseus. There's an excavation going on in the Ural Mountains. For some reason, Perseus wants to salvage the mainframe. The frosty mountain range of Yamantau is a returning location from Black Ops 1. We also play as Mason here with Woods at our side. So this mission is definitely trying to cash in on nostalgia, but I don't mind. I think Cold War does a pretty good job of including nostalgia and fan service when appropriate, but not overdoing it. Cold War mixes the old with the new, but it doesn't rely on the prior games as a crutch. The two men eventually get separated, and Mason has to creep through the shadows himself. During this, he gets occasional flashes of the numbers broadcast, a remnant from his brainwashing in the first game. Along with increasing the nostalgia factor, I also appreciate this detail because it establishes narrative continuity from Black Ops 1 and 2. In the second game, we saw that Mason still suffered from the broadcast signals, so it's nice to have that narrative thread unbroken here. When they reach the mainframe, their pilot Belikov has concerns about its size.
Is the mainframe big? Because if it's too regular size.
This part is so in character for Woods. He's never been one for precise technicalities, so of course he'd lie about it to get their pilot's butt down there to pick it up. Woods and Mason hook a winch into the mainframe, and they have to defend it while Soviets attack. The ascent isn't a smooth one, with the mainframe twisting about and ramming into things, making the shooting hectic. It's a very cinematic but also creative set piece. This mission is a good example of Cold War's general approach. It takes the familiar, in this case the Yamantau setting and our characters, and it does something unique with them, like this mainframe ascent. Once the mainframe's out, Hudson and Black scrape it for intel. Unfortunately, Perseus erased the files, leaving them with nothing, so the mission was a failure. There's only one place now to get the intel they need: the Lubyanka building, the KGB headquarters themselves, the very heart of the beast. At the CIA safe house, Hudson and Adler have another scuffle. Adler's planning on bringing Bell along for the mission, which enrages Hudson.
I don't need Mason or Woods. I need Bell. He's got the skill we need.
Are you enjoying this? You're risking the entire operation unnecessarily.
It's not unnecessary. It's calculated.
In the moment, this seems like something we can just chalk up to Hudson's inherent suspicion and distrust of those around him. It makes sense he'd want his most trusted guys, naturally Woods and Mason, to do this op. However, he's particularly angry about Bell's presence. Given the game's conclusion, well, I'd probably act the exact same way in hindsight. This is another example of how Cold War sets up its plot twist, yet it manages to obfuscate this hint by the nature of Hudson's suspicious personality. Nonetheless, Adler has his way, and the operation commences. The mission starts from Belikov's point of view. He's the trusty pilot from the last mission, and he's also our inside plant. His goal is to secure a bunker key for Adler, so they can access the vault that has the intel they need. But first, Belikov must attend a meeting with top Soviet officials, including the president of the Soviet Union himself, Gorbachev. They discuss the presence of a mole within their ranks. The president has brought aboard Imrav Zakayev to oversee the investigation. He's an interesting inclusion. If you played Modern Warfare, you know he's the primary antagonist. So, Zakayev's presence here seems to be an attempt to unify the Black Ops timeline with the Modern Warfare series, at least the reboot. However, I didn't pick up on any references in the subsequent games, so it seems like these plans may have been cancelled. Then again, I can't say I was looking all too closely for them, so maybe I missed something. However, it would be a bit odd if true. The latest Modern Warfare takes place in the current day ostensibly, yet Black Ops 2, which takes place in 2025, has technology that we're not even near close to using, like advanced robotics and stealth suits. Maybe it's just an Easter egg and I'm overthinking it. At the end, Gorbachev reiterates that they're trying to protect their way of life.
Comrade Belikov, we are in grave danger from the capitalists. Our collective, our very way of life is at risk.
This mirrors President Reagan's speech at the beginning of the game, and it highlights the similarities between them. The CIA and their associates have committed some very questionable acts throughout the game, like Operation Greenlight, and this reflection here serves as another means to make the player question the morality of the team they're playing for. When the meeting is done, Belikov is off to find his key. This is one of the best gameplay segments of the game, and one of the most creative in the entire series. There are a variety of ways Belikov can get a bunker key. For instance, I infiltrated the server room and I rerouted Belikov's incriminating external communications to another official. I printed this off as evidence and presented it to Kravchenko. In the midst of apprehending the official, I made off with the bunker key. My game actually ended up bugging out, and one of the side mission evidence pieces didn't spawn, so I had to restart the mission. And although I didn't record it, I replayed this mission in an entirely different way. Instead, I broke into the armory and stole a blank keycard. I then reprogrammed the keycard with the necessary permissions. Even within this path, there were permutations. I broke into the armory, but I also could have bribed the guard to let me in. This mission also puts the lockpicking mechanic to great use. Guards are on patrol, so you have to pick locks when they aren't looking, which adds a great deal of tension and makes the minigame more engaging. No matter how you go about it, you'll eventually end up with a keycard and let Adler's team in. Then you take the role of Bell, and you infiltrate the facility under disguise with Adler. In the elevator, we run into Zakayev. If you answer his question wrong, he'll try to fight you, but we handily knock him out. That's the last we'll see of Zakhaev. Again, his presence here is just a bit odd. The mission heats up, with Bell and Adler going guns blazing to reach the vault. The mission has excellent pacing. The slow-paced start makes the high-intensity action feel like a welcome payoff. There's definitely a claustrophobic feeling to this mission. We're in the heart of the enemy. We couldn't be more outgunned or outnumbered. The level and gameplay design nicely complements this. We fight through cramped interiors leading to the vault, and have to fend off enemies while opening it. You acutely feel the pressure of the situation. On the way out, they unleash toxic gas to aid their escape. The reduced vision caused by the gas mask is another source of this claustrophobia. Every part of this mission is masterfully designed, from the pacing to the level design to the concept. I think it's about as close to perfect as you can get for a COD level. The intel they recovered was a list of sleeper agents, one of which included a nuclear engineering scientist named Theodore Hastings. They track his movement to Cuba, where they discover a hub for Perseus activity. This is likely the location of the stolen Russian nuke. This mission marks the point of no return for the story, and a last call for the side missions. So I'll use this as a segue to talk about Cold War's side missions. These are a returning feature from Black Ops 2, but they're implemented slightly differently. There are two missions, Operation Red Circus and Operation Chaos. They each include a puzzle which can only be completed by finding 3 sources of intel scattered throughout the levels. The solution is randomized per save file, so you can't simply Google the answer online. The puzzles themselves are pretty good, with you having to compile the information and the clues to uncover double agents and decrypt a floppy disk. Given that we've been consorting an evidence board for the entire game, it feels fitting to manually have to piece together evidence and solve mysteries ourselves. Although the game strongly encourages you to actually solve the puzzles and get the right answers, you don't truly have to. Getting the right solution only changes a few dialogue lines at the end of the game. The missions themselves are pretty standard fare. They're short and don't overstay their welcome. My biggest criticism with them is that they feel like another missed opportunity. In both missions, you play as Alex Mason with Woods at your side. Now don't get me wrong, I love every opportunity to play as the dynamic duo. However, these side missions would have been the perfect opportunity to flesh out the new characters, especially Park and Lazar. We barely get any screen time with them throughout the game, and they feel like distant associates rather than people we care about. This becomes especially relevant in the next main mission. The entire crew heads to Cuba to find Hastings and get the nuke back. However, things take a turn for the worst. Perseus wipes out the scientists, and strangely enough leaves the nukes behind. The reason why is bad. Perseus forced the scientists to reverse engineer the detonation codes. Perseus now has access to all of the nukes that are a part of Operation Greenlight, spread across all Europe. The downward spiral continues. They try to exfil from the roof, but Lazar, Park, and Bell are surrounded by enemies. Their helicopter arrives, but the ground gives way underneath them. Bell can only secure one ally, and you must choose, Park or Lazar. This choice falls a bit flat for me. Park and Lazar have so little screen time, and the game hasn't established them well enough for me to have formed any connection with them. The decision might as well come down to a coin toss for me. It's a shame, because as I pointed out in the video, there were multiple missed opportunities that the game could have used to make this connection stronger, and therefore make this moment land with the emotional punch it was going for. Whether you choose Park or Lazar doesn't really impact the game's story. The survivor will be present in cutscenes for the rest of the game, but there isn't anything more substantial than that. Hudson and Black lament the failure, but there's hope.
Well, that was a goddamn fiasco.
You go in with the intel you have, not the intel you want. We paid the fucking piper down there.
You think this is Bell's fault?
I don't know whose fault it is. I just know that Perseus doesn't have a single fucking nuke. He's got dozens.
Millions of people are gonna die, and the United States will take the blame. You need to find out where he's planning to broadcast the activation signal.
How are we gonna pull that out of our ass?
Bell knows where it is.
Bell? This goddamn science project was a failure!
Don't count Adler out yet. The man has a deep bag of tricks.
Bell? A science project? The game is starting to tip its hand more now. We're nearing the reveal. They return to the CIA safe house. Adler and his team strap Bell into a gurney and wheel them into an operation room. Adler says Bell is the key to stopping Perseus, and has always been. Regardless of how much you've been picking up on the clues throughout the story, it's obvious that something strange is going on here. Adler orders Sims to prepare the dosages. He injects the serum directly into Bell's brain, despite the risks it presents to Bell's health. Then Adler says the phrase we've heard throughout the story.
We had a job to do.
Adler urges Bell to remember Vietnam. There was a bunker that Bell discovered there, and they need to know what Bell found inside. We then hear Perseus' voice, urging Bell not to trust Adler. He's lying.
Do not trust Adler. Adler is lying to you. Do not trust him. Do not listen to Adler.
Adler urges Bell on, starting with the debrief. Bell woke up in the middle of a firefight. Right away, the game establishes that this is an unreliable story with an unreliable narrator. Adler says Bell picked up an M16, but you can pick up a different weapon and the dialogue changes.
You ran forward and picked up an M16. Or maybe it was another weapon.
Bell fights through Viet Cong and comes across a three-forked path. Adler tells Bell to head towards the waterfall. Bell discovers a cave with Soviets. At the end rests the bunker door. If you remember, this is the same red door from the first Vietnam mission, and there's the same yellow flash when Bell opens it. It indicates that during that mission, the memory exercise was the same serum-injecting brainwashing exercise that Bell is currently enduring. As I've been pointing out, the game sets this stuff up really well. When Bell reaches Perseus behind the bunker doors, the flashback abruptly stops. Adler kicks off another attempt. Bell once again finds themselves in the same helicopter. The level is the same one as before, but it's altered slightly. It takes place at night and allows the player to take a stealth approach. After fighting through the rice fields, Bell finds themselves at the three-forked path once more. Adler tells Bell to go in a different direction this time. However, you can refuse. I went down to the waterfall again. If you do so, Adler questions what's going on. Regardless, Bell eventually reaches another bunker door, where there's a neat puzzle. You use projectors to create a door that then materializes. Once we reach Perseus, the memory flickers out. Adler grows agitated and kicks off another attempt. Bell finds themselves in the helicopter again, and must fight through the same rice fields again. This is a cool story beat overall, but I will say it gets pretty old and annoying having to fight through the same level 3 times. I wish they would have done it slightly differently. Eventually, Bell finds themselves in a pretty trippy corridor, and Bell has trouble finding the red door. Adler hits Bell with another injection which could be lethal, but he doesn't care.
Park, give Bell another injection.
That could be...
Do it, now!
Bell's heart rate is already... Heart rate is spiking. I'm not sure how much longer Bell can last.
After the injection, Bell finds the door. They access a terminal, and memories start to flash back to Bell.
We've known each other for years.
It appears the subject's programming is beginning to take hold.
Been through the hell of Vietnam together.
The game is tipping its hand even further. The player understands what's happening. Bell has been programmed by Adler. The flashback ends before Adler gets what he wants. The memory exercise begins yet again. Blissfully, the game skips ahead and doesn't make us fight through the same level again. Adler orders Bell into the ruins. If you disobey, he gets much more aggressive than before, and doors literally slam onto the ground around you. Eventually, you're forced into the room with only the red door. Bell goes inside one last time. Within, we see one of Bell's memories of sitting at a war room table with Perseus. He told Bell where they're headed after getting the Greenlight arsenal. Things are becoming clearer. When Bell wakes up, the past is revealed in full clarity.
Bell, you were one of Perseus's agents. His associate, Arash Kardavar, turned on you at the airstrip in Turkey. Left you for dead.
From there, we fly to Solovetsky.
But I have other plans for you. Perseus thinks too highly of you.
I don't want the competition.
We were there. We found you after everything went down.
From there, Adler's team recovered Bell from the airstrip. You were the person that Arash tried to execute in the airfield. Adler and Park then brainwashed Bell into thinking they were a CIA agent, and even implanted memories of serving with Adler in Vietnam into their head. Why go through all this trouble though? Adler explains.
Interrogation didn't work with you, but thanks to MK Ultra's research, we had a backup plan. If you believed you were someone else, we could lead you to a place where you'd give everything up.
Hudson's words earlier were accurate. You really were Adler's little science project. This also explains why Adler took Bell onto dangerous missions. He wanted Bell to feel like they were trusted, because the more Bell believed their identity, well, the easier it would be to extract information. Bell's innermost secrets had been hidden behind this metaphorical bunker door until now. I think this twist is executed really well. The breadcrumbs were placed excellently throughout the story, as I've hopefully pointed out. From Adler always using the trigger phrase "we have a job to do" to Hudson's suspicion, to the red doors and to everything in between. The hallmark of a good twist is one that you don't see coming, but when it happens, all of the oddities or circumstantial occurrences from the past come into an orderly clarity, and I think this is what Cold War achieves. I've been waiting until now to talk more about Adler's character. I think he's one of the most compelling characters in the entire series. Adler's been pretending to be war buddies with you this whole time. He's been pretending to trust you out of your shared time together. He's seemed to believe in your potential, defending you against the skeptics like Hudson.
I know you can do this. Hudson doesn't trust anyone he can't control.
This revelation, however, puts all of his prior actions into a different light. The kindness he's displayed towards you throughout the game has been fake. He doesn't care about Bell at all, and this is evidenced by how quickly he'll inject Bell with potentially lethal doses to get what he wants. We've seen glimpses of his ruthlessness throughout the story, but this brings his coldness to an entirely different level. Even here, in this revelation, he oscillates between kind and harsh. One moment he's grabbing Bell's throat, the next he's sympathizing, understanding that Bell must hate them.
I realize you probably hate us right now, what we've done to you.
He's an absolute snake, and that's what makes Adler so interesting. He can be a very charming, personable guy. Sometimes it even seems genuine, but there's a ruthlessness to him that goes unmatched. Even Hudson, who's known for being cold, doesn't hold a candle to him. He's a complex man, whose true motives and feelings at any one point are difficult to nail down. As I said, I truly believe he's one of the best written characters in the series, and the best new character in the series in years. Adler asks Bell one last question: where is Perseus? From the flashback, Bell knows Perseus is in Slavetsky. Here is the game's final choice, and it actually does affect the game in a truly substantial way. Bell can either tell the truth about Perseus' location, or Bell can lie. This will dictate the final mission we play and the final outcome of the story. With this in mind, I want to reflect upon the game's story choices in general. It's true that almost none of them have a large impact on the story's outcome. However, they're not useless. They still serve two storytelling purposes. The first is that they condition the player to think morally about the story and its events. You're making decisions on how to deal with potential double agents, whether to kill or spare suspects, which friends to save or sacrifice. Because you're often forced to contend with morals, it puts an even bigger spotlight on the moral ambiguity of the CIA and their opponents. After all, isn't Operation Greenlight at least partially their fault? And especially on the heels of this latest revelation, where your supposed friends have been manipulating you and injecting you with Lord knows what, you're left asking, are these really the good guys? Are these people worth fighting for? These decisions throughout the game prime the player to think about the entire conflict morally. Second, these decisions throughout the game help the player think about and establish Bell as a character. Firstly on moral terms as I've described, but also in terms of personality. Is Bell standoffish or entirely focused on the mission? Depending on how you've defined your Bell, well, you may be more inclined to help or betray Adler here. Both of these purposes, Bell's personality and the moral framing, are both priming the player for this moment, to prepare them to make this decision of weight. Adler himself even points out this is Bell's chance to define who they really are.
This is your chance to define who you really are, Bell.
While the story isn't as dynamic as Black Ops 2 in its network of choices and consequences, I nonetheless still appreciate their inclusion in Cold War. I think it would have been a tough ask to have such a network of outcomes in a game that takes place between game entries. Cold War is more beholden to set continuity, although as we'll see, it isn't afraid of breaking it. So there are two divergent paths from here. Let's go into each of them. I'll start with the good ending, where you tell Adler the truth. Adler affirms Bell's choice and subsequently affirms that Bell's one of them.
You made the right choice, Bell. Come on. You're still one of us.
His voice is warm, but even this is another lie to manipulate Bell. He doesn't think Bell is one of them. It's another example of how many layers of deception he's willing to hide behind. The entire squad deploys in a very hoorah cutscene. They're going to finally catch Perseus and stop him from destroying the free world. As for the mission itself, well, it's actually a bit anticlimactic. It only lasts around 8 to 10 minutes. They infiltrate Perseus' facility and take out AA guns, which allows air support to raise the place and stop Perseus from being able to detonate the nukes. And well, that's it. Perseus himself gets away. Adler resolves that this is a message to Perseus. The immediate threat is stopped, but it doesn't feel like the main conflict is all that resolved. I wanted to do more than just send Perseus a message here. Maybe that's where Black Ops 6 will come in, I guess. I guess I'd have a bigger issue with this ending if Cold War didn't have multiple of them. Hudson and Black speak afterwards, and the game accounts for the smaller narrative actions throughout the game. Whether you killed or spared targets, whether you fully solved the side quests, that sort of thing. So I suppose you could say that these decisions had some impact on the story, but I don't consider this sort of end summary as all that substantial. The final cutscene is Adler and Bell traveling together. Adler has one last loose end to tie up. He turns the gun on Bell, just as Bell raises their own weapon. There's a flash, and it's ambiguous who lives or dies. This is why I said that Adler never saw Bell as one of his team. Bell is just another part of the mission that must be eliminated. So that's how the good ending goes. Now let's see about the bad ending. Bell lies to Adler and tells him that Perseus is in Duga. Adler once again affirms Bell. I think it's funny how confident he is in Bell's brainwashing, that he doesn't even see the possibility of betrayal. One detail I like is that your former allies' nameplates turn red, indicating that they are now your enemy. Bell secretly radios to Perseus and sets up an ambush in Duga. There is a mission debrief cutscene where Adler and his allies set up the operation. This entire cutscene is laden with irony, because we know that they're working off of bad intel. When they arrive, Adler figures out pretty quickly that this is all a setup, but by that point it's too late. Bell and their Russian allies open fire. The game is over. Now it's just cleaning up the mess. Bell kills their former allies one by one, leaving only Adler left. In typical Adler fashion, he tries one last deception, but he dies by the sword as well. Perseus himself then emerges. He wanted to be here for this moment too. Together, he and Bell detonate the nukes. The fallout is as catastrophic as expected. Europe is in smoke, and the US is blamed for all the damages. Perseus awaits the downfall of the US. A final summary of the player's choices follows, much like the good ending, except it's narrated by Perseus. And that's the bad ending. I usually don't like the bad endings in video games, but in Cold War's case, I actually find it a bit more satisfying than the good ending. I think it's because it feels like the bad ending actually brings the story to a close, while the good ending doesn't resolve much. Of course, this bad ending isn't canon, otherwise none of the events in Black Ops 2 could have happened. The good ending is canonical. Still, given Bell's dual alliances, I appreciate the ability for the player to choose. Let's take a step back and look at the game as a whole. As I mentioned at the beginning of the analysis, Cold War is like the greatest hits album of Black Ops games. It takes the characters, the tight pacing, and the plot inversion of Black Ops 1, and it mixes these elements with the story choices, side missions, and focus on moral ambiguity that Black Ops 2 excels at. Then, Cold War also takes some inspiration from Black Ops 3's stellar character customization, pairing it back to something that fits the time era and gameplay structure. On top of its inspiration, Cold War has its own defining elements. The two biggest highlights for me are the introduction of Russell Adler, as well as the stellar level design, both in terms of set pieces and the atmosphere they create. Cold War has its own set of problems. The new characters aside from Adler are a miss. There were just too many missed opportunities to make them connect. And of the elements Cold War takes from its predecessors, I don't think the game surpasses them. I think Black Ops 1's story is more tightly crafted, the choices in Black Ops 2 are better, and so on. But despite its problems, Cold War doesn't feel like an aimless mismatch of its predecessor's successes. Instead, Cold War's design is finely calibrated, resulting in a campaign that feels like a unified experience despite these disparate elements. Along with being a cohesive game, perhaps Cold War's greatest contribution to the series is how it acts like a unifier between the games. This game, with how it picks and chooses elements from its predecessors, feels like a distillation of what the Black Ops series is all about. So let's finally answer the question, what makes a Black Ops campaign a Black Ops campaign? To me, the identity of a Black Ops campaign can be described like this. A Black Ops campaign is set in a world of moral grayness, where the good guys fight dirty and the bad guys themselves sometimes have a point. It's a world where things aren't quite as they seem, and there is a reality that the hero isn't able to recognize at the start of the story. There is a false reality, you could say, that blinds or makes the hero ignorant. Only by diving deep into discomfort, be it by exploring a painful past, or by moving past layers of lies and deception and simulation, oftentimes discovering uncomfortable truths along the way, can the hero remove this false sense of reality and discover the true state of the world. And only by doing this, by ascertaining the true state of the world, can the hero overcome the antagonist. All of the Black Ops games have these elements, and I think Cold War is what really helps solidify this identity in my eyes. I'll be curious to see what Black Ops 6 holds and if it follows this pattern, or if it continues this series' experimentation and goes off in an entirely different direction. Either way, I think the legacy of Cold War is its refinement of the series. It wasn't a perfect game, but given the series' drifting sense of identity when Cold War came out, I think it was the perfect game that arrived at the perfect time. So, we've made it through all of the Black Ops games. It's a series that I have a deep love for. Although it's certainly had its share of rocky moments, I think these faults come from a series that is always pushing the boundaries. It's a series that's always had that sense of innovation. It hasn't settled down to one particular formula that it rides into the sunset. From the masterful storytelling of Black Ops 1, to the branching story of Black Ops 2, to the customization of Black Ops 3, to the synthesis of Cold War, each entry brings something unique to the table. When analyzing Black Ops, it's a story of a series that lost its way then found it once again. Cold War finally declared what it meant to be a Black Ops game. Throughout all the highs and lows, I think, each game has its special place in the grand experiment that we call Black Ops. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this lengthy look at the Black Ops campaigns. If you liked the video, please consider liking and subscribing. If you want to support me further, please consider checking out the Northfield series. As you can probably tell, I have a great passion for telling stories. The link to all my stuff is in the video description. Thanks for the support as always. Until next time.